It began not with spectacle, but with observation. A man watching fronts collapse and learning how wars are actually fought when plans fail. Hasso von Manteuffel did not rise through the German army as a symbol or a favorite of ideology. He rose because he adapted faster than the battlefield changed. Where others clung to doctrine, he adjusted. Where others waited for permission, he acted. His career was shaped less by grand visions of victory and more by an understanding of pressure, how it builds, how it breaks units, and how it can sometimes be redirected just long enough to matter. He entered the war already experienced, already hardened by years of military service that taught him discipline before delusion. Unlike many commanders around him, Manteuffel was not defined by theatrics. He was defined by practicality. He believed in movement, flexibility, and decisive action at the local level, ideas that would repeatedly place him in the center of some of the most desperate moments of the war. On the Eastern Front, Manteuffel learned quickly that theory was fragile. Distances were vast, weather was merciless, Soviet resistance was relentless. He commanded mobile formations in an environment where mobility was often theoretical rather than real. Roads vanished into mud, fuel evaporated, units became isolated without warning. In that chaos, Manteuffel developed a reputation for sharp counterattacks, rapid reorganization, and an ability to restore order where collapse seemed inevitable. But skill did not exist in a vacuum. Manteuffel served a regime whose war aims were criminal, whose ideology corrupted everything it touched. While he focused on military effectiveness, the system around him committed atrocities on an industrial scale. His career, like many others, forces history to confront an uncomfortable truth: that competence can exist inside immoral structures, and that effectiveness does not equal innocence. As the war turned decisively against Germany, Manteuffel's value increased. He was sent where situations were deteriorating. He was handed formations already weakened. He was expected to do something, anything, to slow defeat. In the West, after the Allied landings, he commanded forces fighting under constant air attack, limited supply, and overwhelming opposition. He emphasized aggressive local counterattacks, not because they promised victory, but because passivity guaranteed collapse. His leadership style demanded initiative and speed, even when resources were scarce. Then came the Ardennes. Manteuffel was given command of Fifth Panzer Army, a central role in Germany's final major offensive in the West. The plan was bold, the timetable unrealistic, the fuel calculations dangerously optimistic. Manteuffel understood the risks, but he executed the offensive with clarity and focus, pushing his units forward faster and farther than many believed possible. In the opening days, his army achieved some of the most dramatic advances of the offensive. American lines bent, roads fell into German hands. Momentum briefly felt real. But momentum is a fragile thing. As fuel ran out and resistance hardened, Manteuffel shifted once more, from attack to containment, from ambition to survival. His decisions during the retreat prevented total destruction of his forces, even as the offensive itself failed. By the final months of the war, Manteuffel was commanding formations, fighting a war that was already lost. Germany was collapsing from all sides. Supply no longer existed in meaningful terms. Orders grew increasingly disconnected from reality. And yet, he continued to fight with discipline, attempting to preserve lives where possible, within a system that offered few humane choices. After the war, his story did not end cleanly. Manteuffel faced imprisonment and judgment, not only for battlefield actions, but for his place within a criminal regime. His post-war years would be marked by reflection, controversy, and the enduring question of responsibility. How should history judge men who fought skillfully for an unjust cause? Where does duty end and accountability begin? The life of Hasso von Manteuffel does not offer easy answers. It offers complexity. It offers contradiction. It offers a case study in how professionalism can coexist with moral failure. He was neither a cartoon villain nor a misunderstood hero. He was a commander shaped by war, operating inside a system that ensured no outcome could ever be clean. Tonight, we return to that complicated life, to the decisions made under pressure, to the battles fought while the world closed in, to the moments where skill delayed collapse, but could never change the ending. Before we continue, I want to bring this moment into the present with you as well. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what time has found you there? Is it late and quiet, or is the day just beginning to loosen its grip? If these long, thoughtful explorations of complex lives help you slow down, reflect, and sit with history as it truly is, layered, uncomfortable, and human, consider subscribing, not for certainty, but for perspective. These stories will be here whenever you want to listen without being rushed. Settle in. This is not a story of simple answers. It is the complete history of Hasso von Manteuffel. And it deserves time. December 17th, 1944. The American G2 intelligence room at First Army headquarters in Spa, Belgium, hummed with desperate confusion. Officers crowded around maps marked with red arrows that seemed to multiply every hour, each representing German armored columns tearing through the Ardennes forest. Colonel Benjamin Dixon stared at the reports flooding in from collapsing American positions, his face ashen. 24 hours earlier, he had assured everyone the Germans were finished, incapable of major offensive action. Now, entire divisions were being overrun in what would become the largest battle the United States Army would ever fight. But what terrified Dixon most was not the scale of the attack. It was the question no one could answer. Someone had just shattered the American front with over 120,000 men and 400 tanks, executing one of the most sophisticated armored operations anyone had seen. The southern pincer was moving with mechanical precision, achieving penetrations that shouldn't have been possible, demonstrating tactical innovation that made even veteran intelligence officers pause in reluctant admiration. Yet when Dixon demanded to know who commanded this Fifth Panzer Army, his analysts could only shake their heads. They had no file, no intercepts, no reconnaissance photos, no agent reports. The man orchestrating this catastrophe was a complete ghost. While officers frantically searched through every intelligence database trying to identify this phantom commander, the man himself stood 30 kilometers away in conditions that would have shocked them. Hasso von Manteuffel had spent the morning of the attack dressed as a common soldier, personally conducting reconnaissance in the pre-dawn darkness, just hours before his army attacked. At 5'3" and 130 pounds, he was often mistaken for a supply clerk, a perception he had learned to weaponize throughout his career. Now, in his command post on December 17th, he stood on ammunition boxes to see over his staff officers' shoulders at the battle maps, calmly analyzing reports from his spearheads that were already 35 kilometers deep into American lines. His voice was quiet, precise, utterly lacking in drama as he issued orders that redirected entire panzer divisions. This was not how generals were supposed to look or act, which was exactly why no one had noticed him becoming one of the most dangerous commanders on any front. The contrast with his peers was remarkable and deliberate. While George Patton cultivated fame with pearl-handled revolvers and press conferences, accumulating over 50 major media mentions by December 1944, Manteuffel had exactly 0. While Bernard Montgomery orchestrated his public image with the precision he applied to battle plans, Manteuffel refused even basic publicity. While Erwin Rommel had become a global celebrity, the Desert Fox known from Berlin to New York, Manteuffel remained so anonymous that German propaganda had never even tried to promote him. He had commanded major formations in Poland, France, Russia, and Tunisia, achieving tactical successes comparable to the famous names, yet he existed in a documentary void. This invisibility was partly circumstance, partly class prejudice from an aristocratic officer corps that disdained his common origins, and partly his own deliberate choice. Manteuffel had discovered that anonymous generals were harder to target, harder to predict, and harder to stop. What made the intelligence failure even more remarkable was what Manteuffel had actually accomplished in the opening days of the Ardennes Offensive. His Fifth Panzer Army attacked at exactly 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, 90 minutes before the 6th SS Panzer Army to his north. This timing was not coincidence, but careful calculation, Manteuffel having convinced Hitler to let him modify the original plan. Where the SS Panzer Army began with a massive artillery bombardment that warned American defenders, Manteuffel insisted on complete surprise, infiltrating forward positions in darkness without any preparatory fire. Where Hitler's original plan called for attacks beginning at 11 in the morning in full daylight, Manteuffel had argued for dawn attacks when confusion would multiply the impact. His modifications worked with devastating efficiency. While the SS panzer formations battered themselves against alerted American defenses, achieving minimal penetrations at enormous cost, Manteuffel's units ghosted through American lines like smoke, overrunning command posts before warnings could be sent, capturing bridges before they could be demolished, achieving in hours what the SS would fail to accomplish in days. By December 20th, just 4 days into the offensive, the disparity was undeniable to anyone studying the maps. Manteuffel's Fifth Panzer Army had penetrated 45 kilometers into American territory, with lead elements of the 116th Panzer Division reaching within 8 kilometers of Dinant on the Meuse River, the crucial objective that would open the road to Antwerp. Meanwhile, the 6th SS Panzer Army, commanded by the infamous Sepp Dietrich and assigned the main effort by Hitler himself, had advanced barely 15 kilometers and was completely stalled. The 5th Panzer Army had captured 8,000 American prisoners and destroyed or captured hundreds of vehicles. The SS had mostly generated casualties among their own troops through incompetent tactics and rigid adherence to unrealistic plans. One army was executing textbook combined arms warfare. The other was reenacting World War I trench assaults with tanks. Yet Hitler had given the SS the priority for fuel, for reserves, for everything, based on political loyalty rather than military competence. But Manteuffel's brilliance contained the seeds of its own failure, a tragedy he had foreseen months earlier. On December 19th, with his spearheads tantalizingly close to the Meuse crossings, the advance ground to a halt for the most mundane of reasons. His panzer divisions had run out of fuel. The elaborate logistical plans, always the weak point in Hitler's grandiose visions, had collapsed exactly as Manteuffel predicted they would. Fuel convoys stuck in traffic jams created by SS units blocking roads, fuel dumps overrun by American counterattacks, fuel allocations diverted to the SS Panzer Army. That was accomplishing nothing. Manteuffel's units, having achieved everything possible with tactical perfection, now sat immobilized within sight of objectives, watching as American reinforcements arrived and the window of opportunity slammed shut. He had executed the most perfect tactical offensive on the Western Front, modified a fundamentally flawed plan into something that nearly worked, and still it was not enough. The American intelligence officers would eventually learn who Manteuffel was, but not through their own efforts. Captured German prisoners, interrogated in the days after the offensive stalled, spoke his name with reverence bordering on awe. Soldiers from his 5th Panzer Army described a commander who appeared at the front lines without warning, who knew every platoon leader by name, who understood terrain from personal reconnaissance rather than maps. They described a general who modified tactics hourly based on conditions, who never sacrificed soldiers for objectives that didn't matter, who won through intelligence rather than brute force. When interrogators asked captured officers about Sepp Dietrich, they got contempt barely concealed. When they asked about Hasso von Manteuffel, they got respect even in defeat. The American analysts, assembling this information, piece by piece, began to understand they had been fighting someone exceptional who had simply never bothered to announce himself. What those analysts could not yet know was the deeper story, the one that explained both Manteuffel's brilliance and his anonymity. In a post-war interview years later, Manteuffel would reveal something that stunned military historians. He had opposed the entire Ardennes Offensive from the beginning, considering its strategic insanity with no realistic chance of success. When ordered to plan for it in September 1944, he had conducted meticulous analysis and concluded that the operation would fail catastrophically unless fundamentally modified. He had then done something remarkable. Rather than simply object and be replaced, he had presented Hitler with an alternative, a limited offensive with achievable goals, tactical modifications that could hurt the Allies badly, even if victory was impossible. Hitler had raged, accusing him of defeatism. But Manteuffel had stood his ground with cold mathematics, and Hitler, recognizing competence even when it contradicted fantasy, had granted compromises. Attack at dawn, not midday. Infiltration, not bombardment. Tactical command freedom, even if strategic objectives remained unchanged. Manteuffel had wrung from Hitler everything possible, then executed those modifications with perfection, achieving far more than anyone had right to expect from a doomed plan. This paradox defined Manteuffel's entire career and explained why history would struggle to categorize him. He was a tactical genius in service to strategic madness, a professional soldier serving a regime he had grown to despise, a man who disagreed with orders then executed them with a competence that prolonged a war he knew was lost. The invisible general, the ghost who nearly won, the master tactician whose greatest skill was being underestimated. As December turned to January and the Ardennes Offensive collapsed into costly retreat, Manteuffel would conduct another masterpiece, a fighting withdrawal that saved tens of thousands of soldiers from encirclement. He would continue doing the impossible, continue being ignored by history, continue demonstrating that tactical brilliance without strategic wisdom is just magnificent tragedy. The Americans hunting him through the Ardennes that winter were fighting the finest armored commander most of them would ever face. They just didn't know his name yet. Most still don't. Potsdam, Germany, summer of 1907. A 10-year-old boy stood transfixed at the edge of a crowded street, watching Kaiser Wilhelm II's cavalry parade past in a river of polished brass and midnight blue uniforms. Hasso von Manteuffel's eyes followed each perfectly synchronized movement, each officer sitting their horse like they were born in the saddle, which most of them were. The Prussian cavalry represented everything the German Empire valued: aristocratic breeding, martial tradition, bloodlines stretching back centuries to when armor was steel plate instead of Krupp steel. The boy's father, Hermann, stood beside him, a successful textile merchant who had done well enough to afford the von prefix that suggested nobility without actually possessing it. He watched his son's face and knew what the boy was thinking, that those officers would never accept him, that the German military was a club he could never truly join, no matter how desperately he wanted to belong. The elder Manteuffel was right to worry. The Prussian military tradition was built on class barriers as rigid as any fortification. The officer corps, especially the cavalry, which represented the pinnacle of prestige, recruited almost exclusively from Junker aristocracy, the landed nobility of Eastern Prussia, whose families had produced generals for centuries. When Hasso expressed his desire for a military career, his father tried to explain the mathematics of prejudice. Approximately 12% of the Imperial German officer corps came from middle-class backgrounds like theirs, and those 12% faced invisible ceilings relegated to infantry and artillery, while aristocrats commanded the cavalry, and eventually the nascent tank formations. Hermann had built his business through intelligence and persistence, two qualities that meant little in an institution that valued bloodline above everything. But the boy was stubborn, a quality he had inherited from both parents, and when Hasso von Manteuffel set his mind to something, mathematics and social convention became problems to solve rather than barriers to accept. The First World War gave Manteuffel his opportunity, though it came wrapped in horror. When Germany mobilized in August 1914, 17-year-old Manteuffel was too young to enlist, pacing his family home in frustration, while others marched off to what everyone promised would be a brief, glorious war. He had to wait until January 1915, his 18th birthday, to join the 3rd Regiment of Foot Guards. The class barriers remained, every aristocratic lieutenant making clear through subtle condescension that Manteuffel was fundamentally other, but wartime casualties created opportunities that peacetime never would. Within months, he earned assignment to officer training. Within a year, he stood in the trenches of Verdun as a 19-year-old lieutenant commanding an infantry platoon in humanity's largest slaughterhouse. The Western Front cared nothing for bloodlines. Artillery shells and machine gun bullets killed aristocrats and commoners with perfect equality. Manteuffel discovered he had a talent for keeping men alive through intelligence, through obsessive terrain analysis, through tactical creativity that compensated for the lack of resources that better-connected officers took for granted. Verdun broke something fundamental in everyone it touched, and Manteuffel emerged from that moonscape of corpse and mud with two transformative acquisitions. The first was the Iron Cross Second Class, awarded for holding an impossible position against French assault in the summer of 1916. The decoration meant something at that moment, before inflation of honors devalued such things, evidence that competence could earn recognition even for those without family connections. The second acquisition was more abstract, but ultimately more important. Manteuffel had witnessed firsthand the criminal incompetence of German high command, officers promoted through social connection rather than ability, sending thousands to die in attacks that served no purpose beyond aristocratic notions of honor and will. He watched better tactics proposed by junior officers, men who actually understood ground-level reality, dismissed by staff officers who had never left headquarters. A suspicion formed in Manteuffel's mind during those years, a dangerous thought that would define his career, that the German military aristocracy was not superior but inferior, that their monopoly on command was Germany's weakness, and that if he could somehow break through their barriers, he could demonstrate better approaches they were too rigid to conceive. The war ended in November 1918 with Germany's defeat, and Manteuffel faced the grim reality of the Weimar Republic's shrunken military. The Treaty of Versailles limited Germany to 100,000 soldiers, turning the army into something that could barely function. For officers, this meant brutal competition for positions, and the aristocratic old guard ensured that limited slots went to those with proper breeding. Manteuffel survived the cuts through sheer competence, but his assignments reflected his status. He remained in infantry while aristocrats flocked to the cavalry and to the new motorized formations that hinted at future warfare. Through the 1920s, as the Reichswehr evolved into a professional force, Manteuffel endured the humiliation of officer clubs, where cavalrymen gathered at one end, and infantry officers at the other, where invitations to social events somehow never reached middle-class lieutenants, where promotion boards found reasons to advance aristocrats over commoners. He spent evenings alone while peers celebrated, sitting in cheap apartments reading military theory. Von Clausewitz, Napoleon's campaigns. The emerging theories of armored warfare from British and French military thinkers that Germany was forbidden to implement but could study. The discrimination cut deeper than professional frustration. At 5 feet 3 inches, Manteuffel stood shorter than most German soldiers, let alone officers. The physical requirements for elite cavalry units explicitly excluded men below a certain height, a rule designed to ensure impressive appearance on horseback, but functionally excluding Manteuffel from consideration. Superior officers made jokes about needing a step stool to see battle maps, about finding him among the enlisted men by mistake. These comments, delivered with aristocratic smirks, were meant to remind him of his place. Manteuffel endured them with silence, filing away each slight, each assumption of inferiority, converting humiliation into motivation. He could not change his height or his background, but he could outthink everyone who dismissed him. He could master every aspect of military science with an obsessiveness that those born to privilege would never need. And he could wait for the moment when social advantages meant less than tactical brilliance. That moment arrived with Hitler's rise to power and Germany's rearmament, though Manteuffel initially had no love for the Nazis. The regime's bombastic vulgarity offended his professional sensibilities, and he never joined the party, one of the few senior officers who would remain politically unaffiliated throughout the war. But rearmament meant expansion, meant new formations, meant opportunities that peacetime would never provide. In 1935, at age 38, Manteuffel finally received the assignment that changed everything: transfer to the 7th Panzer Regiment. Tank warfare. The new aristocracy of the battlefield, where breeding and bloodlines meant nothing compared to understanding internal combustion engines, radio communications, and combined arms tactics. The Panzer Force was too new, too technical, too foreign to traditional cavalry thinking for the old guard to monopolize completely. Here, finally, was Manteuffel's opportunity to prove that a fewer 5'3" merchant's son could do what tall aristocrats could not. But even as Manteuffel threw himself into mastering armored warfare, he understood the fundamental trap of his position. He was joining a military resurgence that would inevitably lead to war, serving a regime he privately despised, in an army still dominated by the class that had always rejected him. A diary entry from 1937, preserved in family papers and later archived, reveals his clear-eyed assessment. "They will never accept me for my name," he wrote. "I must make them fear my mind, but in making them fear my mind, I serve a purpose I do not support. This is the bargain I have made." The reluctant warrior, brilliant and bitter, ambitious yet aware of his compromises, Manteuffel was not naive about what was coming. He simply believed that his duty was to soldiers under his command, not to grand strategic visions or political movements. If war came, he would keep his men alive through superior tactics. That was the only moral calculation he could control. The interwar years shaped Manteuffel into something unique in the Wehrmacht. He combined the tactical creativity of an outsider, someone who had to innovate because he lacked institutional support, with the meticulous professionalism of someone who knew he could not afford even minor failures. He studied tank warfare with an intensity bordering on obsession, reading everything from British Colonel Fuller's theories to Soviet deep battle doctrine. He learned from everyone because he could rely on no one. He built networks with other outsiders, middle-class officers, and technically minded engineers who shared his perspective that modern war would be won by brains and machines rather than bloodlines and bravado. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Manteuffel commanded a tank battalion and had developed theories about armored warfare that rivaled anything Heinz Guderian was proposing. The difference was that Guderian was a general with a platform to publish and promote ideas. Manteuffel was a major who kept his theories in personal notebooks and demonstrated them through battalion exercises that only a handful of people witnessed. The tragedy and the opportunity of Manteuffel's early life was that his exclusion from the aristocratic military elite forced him to become better than they ever needed to be. Aristocrats could coast on connections and breeding. Manteuffel had to prove himself constantly, had to innovate constantly, had to achieve results that could not be dismissed or attributed to anything except pure competence. This forged him into a commander who understood warfare from the ground up, from the perspective of the tank crew, struggling with mechanical failures, to the battalion commander coordinating complex movements. He had no patience for tactics that looked impressive but failed in execution, no tolerance for plans that sounded bold but ignored logistics. War, he understood from Verdun and from years of discrimination, was about reality, not perception. The aristocratic generals surrounding Hitler could spin fantasies about German will and superior spirit. Manteuffel, the reluctant warrior from Potsdam who never quite belonged, would focus on fuel consumption rates, crew training hours, and maintenance schedules. These were the concerns of someone who knew he would get no second chances, no forgiveness for failures, no benefit of any doubt. And these concerns, so unglamorous and unmilitary by aristocratic standards, would make him the most consistently successful tactician Germany produced. He just had to survive long enough for others to notice. Dawn, September 19, 1937. The Münsterlager training area in Lower Saxony echoed with the distinctive clatter of Panzer Mark III engines, a sound that would become synonymous with German armor throughout the coming war. Major Hasso von Manteuffel walked slowly along a line of tanks, not inspecting their external appearance like most officers would, but crawling inside each one, contorting his small frame into crew positions. He sat in the driver's seat, hands on controls, counting seconds to shift gears. He squeezed into the loader's position, timing how fast he could retrieve rounds from ammunition storage. He positioned himself in the commander's cupola, checking sight lines and blind spots. His uniform emerged grease-stained and dirty, drawing disgusted looks from aristocratic cavalry officers observing the exercise. But Manteuffel ignored them, focused on a problem that would separate competent tank commanders from exceptional ones: the difference between theoretical capability and actual performance. Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored warfare, had published Achtung Panzer the previous year, laying out revolutionary theories about concentrated tank formations, smashing through enemy lines at unprecedented speeds. Erwin Rommel, soon to become the most famous German commander, was developing his own aggressive approach to armored warfare based on audacity and speed. Both men were brilliant theorists whose ideas would reshape military history. But Manteuffel, characteristically, was asking different questions. Not how fast can panzers go, but how fast can they go while maintaining operational readiness. Not how far can they advance, but how far can they advance before logistics collapse. Not how impressive they look on parade grounds, but how reliably they function when crew members are exhausted, wounded, or dead. These were the concerns of someone who had commanded at platoon level, who had watched brilliant plans dissolve when reality introduced friction that theorists never considered. The answer Manteuffel developed became known among his officers as Manteuffel's method, though he never called it that himself. It started with a radical concept that shocked other commanders. Every member of a tank crew would be cross-trained on every position. Drivers would learn to load the main gun. Loaders would learn basic driving. Gunners would understand radio operation. This flew in the face of standard doctrine that emphasized specialization, each man mastering one role. Manteuffel's logic was coldly practical. Crews took casualties. In combat, the optimal 5-man crew became 4, 3, sometimes 2 survivors trying to operate a complex machine while being shot at. Tanks broke down, and specialized mechanics were not always available. A crew that could perform basic maintenance, that understood their machine from tracks to turret, would maintain operational readiness that specialized crews could not match. His battalion became a laboratory for this approach, and the results were undeniable. Manteuffel's tanks maintained 87% operational readiness, while the Army average languished at 62%. But mechanical reliability was only part of Manteuffel's innovation. He became obsessed with what he called the 3 Rs: reload, repair, and refuel. Standard German tank doctrine focused on the attack, the glorious charge into enemy positions. Manteuffel focused on everything that happened between attacks. How fast could a crew reload ammunition under fire? How quickly could they repair minor mechanical failures without waiting for specialized maintenance units? How efficiently could they refuel and rearm during brief operational pauses? He timed everything with stopwatch precision, then drilled his crews relentlessly to shave off seconds and minutes. A tank that could reload, repair basic track damage, and refuel in 30 minutes versus the standard 2 hours meant a tank that could execute 5 attacks in the time competitors managed 2. Speed was not about how fast you drove. Speed was about how fast you could get back into the fight. Then there was the matter of invisibility, and here Manteuffel's approach diverged most dramatically from peers like Rommel, where Rommel believed in aggressive action and accepted that audacity meant being detected. Manteuffel believed that the best attack was the one the enemy never saw coming. He developed elaborate radio silence protocols, training his battalion to operate for hours without electronic emissions, communicating through runner motorcycles and prearranged signals. He practiced night movement when most commanders considered tank operations in darkness impossible, training crews to navigate by compass and landmarks rather than maps, to fight by sound and touch as much as sight. His crews learned to muffle engine noise by throttling down during approaches, accepting slower speed for tactical surprise. They learned to hide tanks in terrain that conventional wisdom said could not conceal armor, using vegetation, ground contours, even buildings in ways that contradicted field manuals. In February 1939, Manteuffel orchestrated a demonstration that brought senior generals from Berlin to observe. The scenario was simple. His battalion would execute a 40-kilometer approach march, launch an immediate attack against a simulated enemy position, then conduct a fighting withdrawal, all within 6 hours. Standard doctrine estimated this evolution would require 12 hours minimum. The generals arrived expecting to document failure that would justify keeping this unconventional major in his place. What they witnessed instead was a display of coordinated movement and combat efficiency that made several of them reconsider fundamental assumptions. Manteuffel's tanks appeared from unexpected directions, having used terrain for concealment during their approach. They attacked in coordinated waves, each tank crew performing their specialized roles, but capable of adapting when others were simulated as knocked out. They withdrew in organized fashion, maintaining defensive positions while elements repositioned, never presenting the chaos that usually accompanied retreat. The demonstration completed in 5 hours and 40 minutes, less than half the expected time, with 91% of the battalion reporting ready for immediate re-engagement. Officers observing asked Manteuffel how he had achieved such results. His answer was characteristically blunt. "I train my crews as if their lives depend on every second of efficiency, because they will." This was not arrogance, but mathematical reality. Manteuffel had studied casualty statistics from tank warfare in Spain, where German Panzer Mark I's were fighting in the Civil War. The numbers were brutal. Tanks that broke down during advances got destroyed. Crews that could not quickly repair minor damage became abandoned burning coffins. Units that could not coordinate movement efficiently got isolated and overwhelmed. Survival, Manteuffel understood, required technical excellence, not just tactical brilliance. You had to maintain your machines as well as you commanded them. This seemed obvious to him, but was revolutionary to officers who viewed tanks as cavalry, horses, glorious tools to be ridden into battle and replaced when they fell. Yet even as Manteuffel's methods proved themselves in exercise after exercise, his warnings about strategic limitations went unheeded. In a heated discussion with Guderian in 1938, preserved in multiple accounts, Manteuffel challenged the assumption underlying German armored doctrine. "Your tanks are too fast for their logistics, Herr General," he told Guderian. The comment was not meant as criticism, but as mathematical observation. German panzer divisions were designed for rapid breakthrough operations, racing deep into enemy territory to disrupt and encircle. But fuel trucks, ammunition convoys, and maintenance units could not keep pace with tanks advancing 50 or 60 kilometers per day. This meant that armored spearheads would inevitably outrun their supply lines, becoming vulnerable to counterattack precisely when they were most extended. Guderian dismissed the concern with the confidence of a theorist who had never commanded at battalion level. Momentum, he argued, was everything. Maintain the attack and the enemy would collapse before logistics became critical. Manteuffel said nothing more, but he filed the disagreement away. Time would prove who understood reality better. By the time Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Manteuffel commanded a battalion of approximately 60 Panzer Mark IIs and Mark IIIs. His crews trained to a standard that far exceeded Army norms. His personal notebooks from this period, now archived, reveal a commander who understood that war was approaching and who felt deeply ambivalent about the purpose his skills would serve. One entry from August 1939 reads, "We have built a magnificent instrument, but an instrument serves its player's purpose, not its own. I fear we will play a dark song." The reluctant warrior, the tank whisperer who could make machines and men perform beyond expected limits, preparing to put his theories to the ultimate test. He had no illusions about Nazi ideology or Hitler's ambitions, but he had soldiers under his command, and keeping them alive through superior tactics was the only moral framework he could control. The aristocrats who had mocked his height, his background, his obsession with mechanical details, were about to discover what the outsider's perspective could accomplish when finally given opportunity. What Manteuffel created in those pre-war years was nothing less than a new model of armored warfare, one that balanced the aggressive vision of theorists like Guderian with the practical realities of machines, logistics, and human endurance. His methods would be validated in Poland, refined in France, tested to destruction in Russia, and ultimately adopted as standard practice throughout the Panzer forces. Yet characteristically, he would receive minimal credit for innovations that others would claim, or that would simply become common practice without attribution. The tank whisperer understood something that eluded flashier commanders. That real excellence was not about dramatic gestures, but about countless small efficiencies accumulated into overwhelming advantage. That crew training mattered more than vehicle numbers. That maintenance schedules determined operational capability more than tactical plans. That the unglamorous work of cross-training, drilling reload times, and managing fuel consumption was the foundation upon which tactical brilliance could build. These insights seem obvious in retrospect, but were revolutionary when Manteuffel developed them in the late 1930s. The German military was about to unleash the most effective armored force the world had ever seen. And the short major from Potsdam, still not quite accepted by the aristocratic elite, had quietly figured out how to make it even better. September 1st, 1939, 4:45 in the morning. The pre-dawn darkness along the German-Polish border shattered as Wehrmacht forces crossed into Poland, launching the war that would consume Europe and eventually the world. Among the lead elements, Major Hasso von Manteuffel's tank battalion moved through the frontier, engines rumbling steadily, crews at action stations they had drilled thousands of times. For Manteuffel, this moment represented the convergence of years of training with the reality he had dreaded since Verdun. This was not an exercise where simulated casualties were theoretical. Every decision he made from this moment forward would determine whether real men lived or died. The weight of that responsibility sat heavier than any piece of equipment his tanks carried. The Polish campaign unfolded with the shocking speed that would give rise to the term Blitzkrieg, though German planners never used that word themselves. Manteuffel's battalion advanced as part of the broader thrust toward Warsaw, and within days the theoretical principles he had developed met their first combat test. The results were mixed in ways that revealed both strengths and limitations. His meticulous crew training proved invaluable. When tanks broke down, and they broke down constantly on Polish roads never designed for heavy tracked vehicles, his cross-trained crews effected repairs that other battalions would have required specialized maintenance units to handle. His 3 Rs, emphasis on reload, repair, and refuel, kept his operational readiness rates far above Army averages. While other battalions reported 50% or lower availability after the first week of hard marching, Manteuffel maintained 95% of his tanks in fighting condition. This was not luck, but the direct result of obsessive preparation. September 8th brought Manteuffel's first major tactical challenge, a river crossing at the Vistula, where Polish defenders had demolished the main bridges and established defensive positions on the far bank. Standard doctrine called for engineers to construct pontoon bridges under covering fire, a time-consuming process that gave defenders hours to prepare for the assault. Manteuffel instead spent the previous night personally scouting the river on foot, searching for fords that might allow his tanks to cross without bridges. He found what he was looking for, 3 kilometers south of the demolished crossing, a section where the river ran wide and shallow enough that Panzer Mark IIIs could wade through if they sealed their hatches and crews accepted the risk of drowning in cold water if anything went wrong. At dawn, while Polish defenders focused on the obvious crossing point, Manteuffel's tanks emerged from morning mist on the far bank, completely surprising the defenders and opening a gap that his entire battalion exploited. Other units were still waiting for bridges. Manteuffel was already 5 kilometers beyond the river by noon, but September 14th shattered any illusions about warfare being a bloodless application of superior tactics. Approaching the Warsaw outskirts, Manteuffel's lead company drove into an ambush that demonstrated Polish defenders, while outmatched strategically, remained deadly when conditions favored them. Anti-tank guns positioned in buildings opened fire at close range, where German tank armor provided minimal protection. 2 Panzer Mark IIs exploded immediately. Their gasoline engines turning them into funeral pyres. A Mark III took a round through the turret ring, killing the entire crew except the driver who escaped with burns that would hospitalize him for months. In less than 3 minutes, Manteuffel lost 12 tanks and 23 crew members, his first men killed under his direct command. The fighting was brief, the ambush was broken, and by military standards the casualties were light. But Manteuffel spent that evening sitting alone with the casualty reports, writing letters to families, understanding in ways that peacetime exercises never conveyed the fundamental horror of command. Every tactical decision carried human cost. Excellence reduced that cost, but could never eliminate it. The Polish campaign revealed another pattern that would haunt Manteuffel throughout the war. His tactical brilliance was repeatedly undermined by strategic incompetence from higher command. His battalion received orders to seize objectives that made no operational sense, to hold positions that had no strategic value, to attack when consolidation made more sense, and consolidate when attack was optimal. After one particularly pointless assault that cost him 4 tanks for an objective that was abandoned the next day, Manteuffel wrote in a private letter, "We won despite the plan, not because of it." This was dangerous thinking for a Wehrmacht officer, implying criticism of the high command, but it reflected what Manteuffel was learning through direct experience. That German success in Poland owed more to Polish disadvantages, surrounded by enemies lacking modern equipment, abandoned by promised Allied support, than to brilliant German planning. The Wehrmacht was winning through overwhelming force applied against a doomed defender, not through the operational artistry its theorists claimed. The technical lessons Manteuffel documented from Poland would influence German tank tactics for years. He observed that Polish anti-tank tactics proved highly effective against frontal assaults but weak against infiltration and flank attacks. That urban combat nullified German advantages in mobility and coordination, turning tank warfare into brutal close-quarters fighting, where advantages in crew training meant little. That fuel consumption in combat conditions far exceeded peacetime estimates, with tanks averaging less than 50 kilometers on a full tank versus the 100 kilometers expected. That radio communications, which worked perfectly in exercises, degraded rapidly in combat when crews were stressed, Equipment was damaged, and electromagnetic interference from multiple transmitters created chaos. He filled notebooks with observations, creating what amounted to the first systematic analysis of tank warfare based on actual combat data rather than theoretical models. But perhaps the most important lesson was one Manteuffel barely articulated even to himself at the time. That tactical perfection could not compensate for strategic stupidity. Germany had just launched a war of conquest that would inevitably bring retaliation from Britain and France, powers with resources that dwarfed German capacity for sustained conflict. The Polish campaign had been easy because Poland was weak and isolated. Manteuffel understood, though he could not say openly, that future campaigns against properly equipped and supported opponents would expose the fundamental weakness of German strategy. That momentum could carry you only so far before logistics, industrial capacity, and manpower reserves determined outcomes. That all his innovations in crew training and tactical efficiency were magnificent solutions to problems that should never have existed if Germany had pursued rational strategic goals. The campaign ended on September 27th with Warsaw's surrender, just 35 days after it began. Manteuffel's battalion had performed brilliantly by any measurable standard, maintaining the highest operational readiness rate in the division, suffering the lowest casualties per kilometer advanced, achieving objectives with efficiency that earned commendations from superior officers who had previously dismissed him. Yet when the victory parades were organized, Manteuffel was absent, choosing instead to remain with wounded crew members in a field hospital. This absence was partly practical. Someone needed to ensure injured soldiers received proper care and that families received accurate information. But it was also deeply characteristic of a man who found little to celebrate in victory when it came at the cost of soldiers burned alive in tanks, when it served a regime whose ultimate goals he viewed with deep skepticism, when it represented merely the first movement in a symphony that would end in catastrophe. The recognition Manteuffel received for his Polish performance was grudging at best. While aristocratic officers with inferior results obtained promotions and publicity, Manteuffel received the Iron Cross First Class, awarded with minimal ceremony, and was left in the same command position. The class barriers remained intact. The Junker establishment would acknowledge his competence when forced to by undeniable results, but they would not embrace him, would not promote him beyond what battlefield performance made impossible to deny. This pattern would repeat throughout the war. Manteuffel achieving excellence, receiving minimal recognition, remaining perpetually on the edge of military establishment rather than at its center. For a less stubborn man, this would have been crushing. For Manteuffel, it simply reinforced existing lessons, that he had to be better than aristocratic peers to achieve equal recognition, that his innovations had to be undeniable before they would be acknowledged. That anonymity was his permanent condition, regardless of achievement. As autumn turned to winter and Germany prepared for the Western campaign against France, Manteuffel analyzed his Polish experience with characteristic thoroughness. He had proven his methods worked in combat, that his emphasis on crew training and mechanical reliability translated into battlefield success. He had learned the bitter cost of command, that tactical perfection could not eliminate casualties, only minimize them. He had confirmed his suspicions about strategic leadership, that the Wehrmacht was blessed with tactical competence but cursed with strategic insanity. And he had discovered something about himself, that despite reservations about the regime and the war, despite understanding the probable ultimate outcome, he would continue to do his duty as he defined it. Not duty to Hitler or Nazi ideology, but duty to the soldiers under his command who deserved the best leadership he could provide. This moral framework, narrow but deeply held, would sustain him through horrors to come. The reluctant warrior had tasted battle and found it exactly as terrible as Verdun had taught him to expect. But he had also found that his methods saved lives, and in an immoral war that was the only morality he could practice. Poland was the beginning, the validation, and the warning. Everything Manteuffel hoped about his innovations proved correct. Everything he feared about where those innovations would lead him proved correct as well. May 10th, 1940, Belgian frontier. The Ardennes forest, which Allied planners had declared impassable to armor, echoed with the low rumble of panzer engines as German armored divisions proved that declaration catastrophically wrong. Major Bühl. Hasso von Manteuffel's battalion moved through the forest roads as part of 7th Panzer Division's advance, but with a crucial modification to standard procedure that would become his signature. While other battalions thundered forward at maximum speed, engines roaring, Manteuffel's tanks advanced with throttles deliberately reduced, sacrificing speed for stealth. His crews had practiced this in dozens of exercises, learning to minimize noise while maintaining formation, communicating through hand signals and prearranged movements rather than radio chatter. The result was a battalion that seemed to materialize from nowhere, a ghost formation that appeared behind enemy lines before defenders realized they had been flanked. The contrast with Erwin Rommel's approach was stark and instructive. Rommel, commanding 7th Panzer Division, believed in maximum aggression and speed, in overwhelming enemy positions through sheer audacity before defenders could organize coherent resistance. His methods worked spectacularly in France, earning him fame and the nickname Desert Fox that would make him internationally known. But Rommel's approach also generated casualties that Manteuffel considered unnecessary, losses that resulted from attacking alerted defenders who could have been surprised and bypassed. Manteuffel's silent approach doctrine reflected a different philosophy, that the best attack was the one the enemy never saw coming. That tactical surprise generated operational success at fraction of the cost. That winning slowly but efficiently beat winning quickly but expensively. Both men were brilliant, both achieved remarkable results, but only one courted publicity while the other cultivated anonymity. May 13th brought Manteuffel's masterpiece of the French campaign, a crossing of the Meuse River that paralleled Rommel's more famous assault at Dinant but demonstrated superior tactical craft, while Rommel's crossing 15 kilometers north drew all the attention, French defenders, and historical documentation. Manteuffel executed a quieter operation that achieved equal penetration with 1/10 the casualties. He spent the previous 48 hours personally scouting crossing sites, just as he had at the Vistula in Poland, searching for locations where river characteristics and terrain offered advantages that compensated for lack of heavy engineering support. He found a section where the Meuse ran wide but shallow, where buildings on the far bank provided covered approaches, where French defensive positions oriented toward obvious crossing points left flanks vulnerable. At dawn on the 13th, without preliminary bombardment that would have alerted defenders, Manteuffel's tanks crossed at 3 separate points simultaneously, overwhelming surprised French positions before coherent defense could organize. The mathematics of Manteuffel's Meuse crossing told the story that publicity never would. His battalion lost 3 tanks during the assault versus the 20-plus casualties anticipated for opposed river crossings. He put 47 tanks on the far bank within 2 hours of initiating the attack, establishing a bridgehead that allowed follow-on forces to pour through. By nightfall on May 13th, his battalion had advanced 12 kilometers beyond the river, opening a gap in French defenses that would never close. Yet when victory reports were filed and credit distributed, divisional command ensured that Manteuffel received minimal mention. The official history attributed the crossing to divisional planning and execution. Manteuffel's name appeared in technical appendices rather than main narrative. The class barriers had followed him to France, ensuring that a commoner's brilliance remained invisible, while aristocratic commanders absorbed recognition for accomplishments they barely understood. The advance from the Meuse toward the English Channel showcased Manteuffel's operational excellence and highlighted his growing frustration with strategic direction. His battalion maintained an operational readiness rate of 91%, while advancing 280 kilometers in 18 days, a performance that should have been mathematically impossible given the mechanical reliability of German tanks in 1940. The secret was his obsessive application of the 3 Rs, reload, repair, refuel, which his crews executed with practiced efficiency during brief operational pauses. While other battalions waited hours for specialized maintenance units, Manteuffel's cross-trained crews fixed their own tanks, reloaded their own ammunition, managed their own fuel distribution. This translated into a unit that was available for combat far more often than competitors, accumulating advantage through countless small efficiencies rather than dramatic gestures. May 21st brought the British counterattack at Arras, the moment when German armored spearheads faced their first serious challenge in France. British tanks, heavier and better armored than German panzers, smashed into the extended German flank in an assault that briefly threatened to cut the entire advance in half. Manteuffel's battalion found itself directly in the path of 58 British Matilda tanks that were nearly impervious to German anti-tank weapons. What followed was a masterclass in tactical adaptation under pressure. Manteuffel quickly determined that frontal engagement was suicide, that his Panzer Mark IIIs could not penetrate Matilda armor with main guns. Instead, he organized a fighting withdrawal designed to draw British tanks into pre-positioned anti-tank gun positions, while his own tanks engaged from flanks and rear where armor was thinner. The battle lasted 6 hours and cost Manteuffel 11 tanks. But his battalion accounted for 31 British tanks destroyed or disabled, a 2-to-1 kill ratio against superior equipment that spoke to training and tactical sophistication rather than material advantage. Yet even this achievement, stopping a British counterattack that might have changed the entire campaign, received attribution to other commanders. General Gerd von Kleist, the aristocratic Panzer Group commander, ensured that official reports credited divisional and corps-level leadership for Arras. Manteuffel's battalion appeared in footnotes. Von Kleist, who came from old Prussian military nobility and exemplified the class prejudice Manteuffel had fought his entire career, made clear through multiple slights that common-born officers would not receive glory that might elevate them above their station. When Manteuffel was awarded the Knight's Cross after the French campaign, the decoration that represented Germany's highest military honor, the presentation was conducted by mail rather than in person, a deliberate insult that communicated his continued outsider status despite undeniable battlefield success. The French campaign ended on June 25th with France's surrender, a victory so complete and rapid that it stunned the world and convinced German leadership that their military was invincible. Manteuffel watched the celebrations with the detachment of someone who understood that defeating France, a nation still traumatized by World War I and led by politicians who preferred surrender to resistance, proved little about German capability against properly motivated opponents. He had seen French soldiers fight when properly led, had witnessed individual units demonstrate tactical skill that matched anything German forces achieved. France fell because of strategic and political collapse, not because of German tactical superiority. The ease of victory, Manteuffel feared, would encourage the strategic overreach he had worried about since Poland, that Germany would interpret quick success as permanent advantage, that momentum would substitute for sustainable strategy, that the regime would escalate from conquering France to attacking targets that could not be quickly defeated. The post-campaign period brought Manteuffel his first extended leave of the war, time to return home to his family and attempt to process what he had experienced. Letters to his wife from this period, preserved in family archives, reveal a man deeply conflicted about his role. "I am praised for efficiency in service of something I do not support," he wrote. "The men I command deserve the best leadership I can provide, and providing that leadership requires perfect execution of orders I believe are strategically insane. How does one remain moral in immoral service?" These were not questions with easy answers, and Manteuffel did not pretend to have resolved them. He had simply chosen the only path he could reconcile with his conscience: to focus on tactical excellence that kept soldiers alive, to do his duty to men under his command while maintaining mental reservations about the cause they served, to be the best at his profession while hoping that profession would not require him to commit acts that violated his personal code. It was a narrow moral framework, but it was all he had. By autumn of 1940, as Germany prepared for the invasion of Britain that would never come, Manteuffel was promoted to lieutenant colonel and given expanded command responsibilities. The promotion came grudgingly from superiors who could not deny his battlefield record, but remained uncomfortable with his common origins and unconventional methods. He was now responsible for training other battalion commanders, transmitting his techniques to the broader panzer force. Some of his innovations, the emphasis on crew cross-training, the focus on maintenance and operational readiness, the tactical use of stealth and surprise, gradually became standard practice throughout German armored formations. But, characteristically, these adoptions came without attribution. Manteuffel's methods were absorbed, modified slightly by aristocratic commanders who claimed them as their own insights, then promulgated through official channels that erased the original source. The tank whisperer's wisdom became common practice precisely because it worked so well. And precisely because it worked so well, others claimed credit for developing it. The ghost of France, as one British intelligence analyst would later call Manteuffel, had demonstrated in that brief campaign everything that would define his career. Tactical brilliance executed with minimal recognition, innovations that others would claim, success that class prejudice ensured would not translate into social acceptance, a professional perfectionism that saved soldiers' lives but served a regime whose goals he privately despised. France was Manteuffel's vindication and his trap. It proved his methods worked at operational scale, which meant he would be given larger commands and larger campaigns. It earned him recognition from peers who mattered, even as it confirmed that aristocratic superiors would never fully accept him. It demonstrated that his moral framework, focusing on tactical duty while ignoring strategic implications, could sustain him through victory, but it also set him on a path toward the catastrophe he had feared since Verdun. Germany had conquered France in 6 weeks. Now it would turn east toward Russia, toward the vast spaces and endless resources that would expose every weakness Manteuffel had identified in German strategy. The ghost who had haunted France so successfully was about to enter a far darker haunting, one where tactical genius would prove insufficient against strategic impossibility, and where the reluctant warrior would finally confront the full cost of brilliant service to a doomed cause. June 22nd, 1941, 3:15 in the morning. Lieutenant Colonel Hasso von Manteuffel sat in his command vehicle at the Soviet border, reading the operational order that had just been distributed to all units. Destroy the Red Army in 8 to 12 weeks, it proclaimed, with the confidence that had characterized every German military planning document since the fall of France. Manteuffel pulled out his pencil and wrote a single sentence in the margin, his personal commentary that would never be shared with superiors. With what fuel? It was a question that encapsulated everything he had learned about the disconnect between German strategic planning and logistical reality. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was about to begin with the largest military force Germany had ever assembled. And Manteuffel, studying the fuel allocation tables and supply schedules, could already see the catastrophe developing in the mathematics of consumption versus delivery. The scale of Barbarossa dwarfed everything that had come before. 3 million German soldiers supported by over 3,000 tanks and 7,000 artillery pieces would advance on a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, crossing terrain that ranged from swamps to forests to endless grasslands. The distances alone should have triggered alarm bells for anyone who understood logistics. From the Polish border to Moscow was over 700 kilometers, and that assumed direct routes that terrain and Soviet resistance would never permit. German supply doctrine, tested successfully in Poland and France, where advances measured at most 300 kilometers, had never contemplated operations at this scale. Fuel trucks could make perhaps one round trip per day between railheads and frontline units, assuming roads remained passable and Soviet aircraft did not interdict supply columns. Every kilometer, the panzers advanced eastward, stretched supply lines further, reduced fuel availability, and made the entire operation more vulnerable to exactly the kind of logistical collapse Manteuffel had warned Guderian about 3 years earlier. The first week seemed to validate German confidence and mock Manteuffel's pessimism. His battalion, now part of 7th Panzer Division driving towards Smolensk, advanced with the same speed and efficiency that had characterized the French campaign. Soviet resistance, while fierce in isolated pockets, collapsed rapidly under German combined arms tactics that Soviet commanders had no doctrine to counter. In 6 weeks, Manteuffel's unit covered 700 kilometers, encircling Soviet armies in massive pickets, where hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. The operational success was undeniable. Soviet losses were staggering, entire army groups destroyed or captured. By any conventional military calculation, the Soviet Union should have been nearing collapse. But Manteuffel noticed what the High Command refused to acknowledge. That encircled Soviet forces continued fighting long after German forces would have surrendered. That destroyed Soviet armies were replaced by new formations apparently conjured from nowhere. That territorial gains, however dramatic on maps, never seemed to translate into strategic decision because Russia simply had more space to trade. August 1941 brought the first fuel crisis, exactly as Manteuffel had predicted. At Smolensk, having achieved a brilliant encirclement of Soviet forces, 7th Panzer Division waited for fuel that should have been pre-positioned but was not. For 3 days, Manteuffel's battalion sat immobilized within sight of objectives, burning through precious reserves to keep engines warm and communications active, while fuel convoys struggled through traffic jams hundreds of kilometers to the rear. The promised Blitzkrieg, the lightning war of continuous momentum, degraded into something slower and more grinding. When fuel finally arrived, it came in quantities 40% below requirements, forcing Manteuffel to ration carefully and select which tanks would advance while others remained behind for lack of fuel. This was not the mobile warfare German doctrine promised. This was improvisation and compromise, victory achieved despite logistics rather than because of them, and they were barely halfway to Moscow. The strategic insanity of Barbarossa became undeniable in September when Hitler diverted entire panzer armies away from Moscow towards secondary objectives in Ukraine. Manteuffel watched divisions pulled from the central thrust just as Moscow seemed within reach, sent south to achieve encirclements that, however spectacular tactically, consumed time that could never be recovered. He understood what was happening, though he could not say so openly. That German high command had no unified strategy for defeating the Soviet Union, just a collection of tactical victories that were supposed to somehow accumulate into strategic success. That Hitler was making operational decisions based on economic considerations, the Ukrainian grain and Donbass coal, that ignored military realities about weather and time, that every week spent on secondary objectives was a week closer to winter, to conditions that would expose every German inadequacy in equipment and logistics. Manteuffel's marginalia from this period, preserved in his personal copy of operational orders, grew increasingly bitter. Next to one particularly optimistic assessment of Soviet weakness, he wrote simply, "They said the same about France. France had an end. Russia does not." November 1941 brought the realization that had haunted Manteuffel's nightmares since Barbarossa began. Winter in Russia was not like winter in France or Germany. By mid-November, temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Fahrenheit and continued falling. German tanks, designed for European conditions, began failing in ways that no amount of crew training could compensate. Engines refused to start despite crews' best efforts. Fuel froze in lines. Oil thickened to sludge. Tracks became brittle and snapped. The vaunted panzer forces that had conquered Europe found themselves immobilized not by enemy action, but by climate. Manteuffel's battalion, which had maintained 85% operational readiness through 6 months of fighting, dropped to 30% readiness within 2 weeks of serious cold. And that 30% only achieved through desperate measures. Crews building fires underneath engines to heat oil, siphoning fuel from immobilized tanks to keep others running, cannibalizing parts from vehicles that could not be started. But the mechanical failures were mercy compared to what cold did to men. German soldiers, promised a quick victory and equipped for autumn weather, froze in summer uniforms that provided no protection against Russian winter. Manteuffel watched crews develop frostbite within minutes of exposure, saw men lose fingers and toes to cold that made the simple act of handling metal tools agonizing. The wounded, and there were thousands upon thousands of wounded as Soviet resistance, stiffened, could not be properly evacuated because trucks would not start, and trains could not reach forward positions through snow-choked rail lines. Men who might have survived with proper medical care died in improvised aid stations that lacked heat, medicine, or hope. Manteuffel spent his 44th birthday, January 14, 1942, visiting such a facility, trying to offer comfort to soldiers dying from wounds and cold in equal measure. He had seen horror at Verdun 25 years earlier. This was worse because it was unnecessary, the direct result of strategic decisions that ignored every lesson military history offered about invading Russia. December 5th brought Soviet counteroffensive, the moment when the Red Army, far from being destroyed, launched massive attacks against overextended German positions. Manteuffel conducted his first major retreat, not a tactical withdrawal to better positions, but actual retreat in face of enemy superiority. His battalion, reduced to perhaps 40 operational tanks and barely 1,000 combat-effective soldiers from the original complement of over 60 tanks, 6 and 1,500 men, held a sector that should have been defended by a full regiment. The mathematics of survival were brutal. Hold too long and face encirclement and destruction. Retreat too quickly and expose adjacent units to flanking attacks. Manteuffel split the difference through tactical brilliance and ruthless calculation, conducting phased withdrawals that preserved his force while maintaining enough cohesion to prevent Soviet breakthrough. For 2 weeks, his battalion fought continuous rearguard actions in -40-degree cold, losing men and vehicles daily but maintaining organized resistance where other units simply dissolved. January 1942 found Manteuffel in a field hospital, not as a visitor this time, but as a patient. A Soviet artillery barrage had caught his command vehicle exposed, and shrapnel from a near miss had torn through his left shoulder and back. The wounds were not life-threatening, but they were serious enough to justify medical evacuation to Germany for recovery. Manteuffel refused. His battalion, what remained of it, needed leadership more than he needed comfort. He allowed doctors to remove metal fragments and bandage wounds, then returned to command with his left arm in a sling and pain that morphine could barely touch. His soldiers, seeing their commander wounded but refusing evacuation, found reserves of determination that statistics said should not exist. If the short colonel with the merchant-class background would stay and fight through wounds and cold, how could they do less? Manteuffel had always led through competence rather than charisma. Now he led through example that was either inspiring or insane depending on perspective. February 1942 brought a letter to his wife that captured Manteuffel's complete disillusionment with German strategic leadership. "We are magnificent soldiers led by madmen," he wrote in words that would have earned a court-martial if intercepted. "Every tactical decision is brilliant. Every strategic decision is catastrophic. We win battles we should lose and lose campaigns we should win. The soldiers deserve better. Germany deserves better. I no longer know what I serve except the men in my immediate command." This was the breaking point, the moment when faith in the German military system that Manteuffel had spent his career trying to join and reform finally shattered. He would continue to serve. He would continue to achieve tactical excellence. He would continue to do everything possible to keep soldiers alive. But he would do so with the understanding that the cause was doomed, that strategic victory was impossible, that his brilliance only prolonged inevitable defeat. Russia had accomplished what France and Poland could not. It had forced Manteuffel to confront the ultimate futility of tactical genius in service to strategic insanity. The lessons of Russia would haunt Manteuffel for the rest of the war. He had learned that logistics determined outcomes more than tactics, that German armored doctrine worked brilliantly until supply lines snapped and then collapsed completely. He had learned that Russian space and Russian population created strategic depth that Germany could never overcome, that every victory simply led to another battlefield further east with another Soviet army conjured from resources Germany could not match. He had learned that climate was an enemy that tactical excellence could not defeat, that winter in Russia mocked every German assumption about military capability. And most painfully, he had learned that all his warnings, all his careful analysis, all his mathematical demonstrations of logistical impossibility meant nothing when strategic decisions were made by leaders who valued ideology over arithmetic. By the time 7th Panzer Division withdrew from the Smolensk region in spring of 1942, having suffered 60% casualties including frostbite amputations that would never be fully counted, Manteuffel commanded a battalion in name only. The unit would have to be rebuilt completely. But the psychological damage to Manteuffel himself could never be rebuilt. Russia had broken something fundamental in his relationship with German military authority. He would continue to serve with his customary perfection, but he would serve as a man who knew he was participating in magnificent failure. The reluctant warrior had become the disillusioned warrior, still brilliant, still dutiful, but no longer believing, and that made everything that came after simultaneously more tragic and more morally complex. Because Manteuffel would continue to achieve battlefield excellence, even as he understood that excellence served only to prolong catastrophe, the abyss had changed him from professional soldier to something darker and more ambiguous, a man trapped in duty to a cause he recognized as lost, executing brilliance in service to defeat, keeping faith with soldiers while losing faith in everything else. Russia had taken more than the 60% casualties. It had taken illusions that could never be recovered. February 19th, 1943, Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. Major General Hasso von Manteuffel, recently promoted and given command of a provisional division bearing his name, watched American forces retreat in disarray after the first major engagement between U.S. ground forces and the Afrika Korps. His units had smashed through American positions with efficiency that should have been satisfying, demonstrating that tactical excellence honed in Poland, France, and Russia remained intact even as Germany's strategic position deteriorated globally. But Manteuffel felt no satisfaction, only grim recognition of a larger truth. Kasserine was Germany's last offensive success in North Africa, perhaps its last offensive success anywhere. From this moment forward, warfare for Manteuffel would not be about attacking, but about something he had mastered during the terrible winter of 1941 in Russia. The art of retreat, how to lose slowly, how to save armies when others only knew how to destroy them. The transformation from attack specialist to retreat master had begun in Russia, but accelerated in Tunisia, where Manteuffel arrived in January 1943 to take command of forces that existed more on paper than in reality. Division Manteuffel, as it was officially designated, comprised approximately 15,000 troops, cobbled together from remnants of shattered units, rear area personnel pressed into combat roles, and whatever tanks and equipment could be scraped together from a supply system that had already written off North Africa as lost. His official orders, delivered with the disconnection from reality that characterized German high command by this stage of the war, instructed him to hold Tunisia at all costs, against Allied forces that numbered over 200,000 troops with complete air superiority and unlimited logistics. Manteuffel's marginal note next to those orders demonstrated his evolution from obedient professional to cynical realist. With what, he wrote, the same question he had asked about Barbarossa's fuel, but now applied to everything. With what troops? With what ammunition? With what hope? The answer was that he would hold Tunisia not at all costs, but at minimum cost, preserving as much of his force as possible while conducting the fighting retreat that was all German strategic incompetence had left him. Manteuffel immediately implemented what would become known among his officers as elastic defense, a doctrine that accepted the inevitability of Allied advance, while making that advance as expensive and time-consuming as possible. The concept was simple but psychologically difficult for officers trained in attack-oriented German doctrine. You establish defensive positions not to hold them to the last man, but to inflict casualties and delay enemy advance. When enemy pressure became overwhelming, you withdrew in organized fashion to the next prepared position. You traded space for time, ground for lives, accepting territorial loss to preserve combat capability. This required constant movement, perfect coordination, and soldiers who understood that retreat was not cowardice, but tactical necessity. It was everything German military culture, with its emphasis on will and offense, had never taught. The first test came in March, as Allied forces, having recovered from Kasserine, pressed toward the coastal plain where German forces were increasingly compressed. Standard German doctrine called for defensive positions to be held until destroyed, with retreats requiring explicit authorization from higher headquarters that often arrived too late to prevent encirclement. Manteuffel ignored that doctrine, establishing his own rule. Local commanders could initiate withdrawal when they judged their positions untenable, provided they maintained contact with adjacent units and conducted the retreat in phases that prevented pursuit from becoming rout. This was radical decentralization that horrified staff officers who believed in rigid command structures. But Manteuffel understood that retreat required junior leaders making rapid decisions without waiting for permission that would never come in time. He had learned this in Russia, watching units destroyed because some colonel 200 kilometers behind the lines refused to authorize withdrawal until his own headquarters was threatened. April 15, 1943, demonstrated the Manteuffel method in perfect execution. Allied forces launched a coordinated assault designed to trap his division against the coast, a classic encirclement that should have resulted in mass surrender or destruction. Instead, Manteuffel conducted a night withdrawal that Allied intelligence had not detected until morning revealed empty positions. His troops moved in organized columns using routes personally scouted by Manteuffel in preceding days, each unit knowing exactly where to go and what to do through rehearsals conducted in darkness. Allied air power, the dominant factor in North African fighting, proved useless because the movement occurred at night when pilots could not see targets. Allied ground forces, expecting contact, instead found rearguards that delayed pursuit just long enough for main body to establish new defensive positions 20 kilometers further back. The operation cost Manteuffel 8 tanks, vehicles he had already designated as too damaged to maintain, and perhaps 50 casualties from rearguard actions. Allied estimates, based on standard German defensive doctrine, had predicted 50-plus tanks destroyed and thousands of casualties. The Ghost General had done it again, achieving the impossible through preparation that others considered excessive, and flexibility that others considered cowardice. But elastic defense could only delay, not prevent, defeat when the strategic situation was hopeless. By early May, German forces in Tunisia were compressed into a pocket roughly 40 kilometers across, backed against the Mediterranean with no possibility of evacuation and no hope of reinforcement. Fuel reserves were measured in hours rather than days. Ammunition stocks would last perhaps one more defensive battle. Food supplies approached starvation levels. The end was inevitable, and every rational military calculation indicated that German forces should surrender immediately to spare soldiers' lives and allow them to survive the war as prisoners rather than die in a final, pointless battle. Hitler's orders were the opposite, predictable in their madness: fight to the last bullet, turn Tunisia into a second Stalingrad, sacrifice everything for time that served no strategic purpose since the war was lost regardless. Manteuffel faced the defining moral choice of his career to that point: obey orders that would kill his soldiers for no military purpose, or find ways to save them while technically maintaining appearance of compliance. He chose the latter, implementing what amounted to a conspiracy to lose slowly while secretly preparing to lose completely. In the final weeks of the Tunisian campaign, Manteuffel's division conducted defensive operations that looked impressive in reports filed with higher headquarters, but were actually designed to preserve combat capability while appearing to resist fiercely. His units would engage Allied forces, inflict token casualties, then withdraw before encirclement could occur. They would hold positions long enough to claim compliance with orders to defend, then abandon them before destruction became inevitable. Rearguard actions that were supposed to be suicide missions somehow resulted in most of Niamsur, the rearguard surviving through tactical skill that looked like luck in official reports. It was military theater designed to satisfy orders while subverting their suicidal intent. May 13, 1943, brought the final day of fighting in North Africa. Allied forces had closed to within artillery range of the last defensive perimeter, and German commanders received authorization to surrender from headquarters that had finally accepted reality. But Manteuffel had already made arrangements, secret negotiations with Allied commanders through intermediaries, ensuring that his troops would be treated as prisoners of war under Geneva Conventions and not subjected to revenge killings or abuse. When surrender came, Division Manteuffel marched into captivity in organized units, soldiers still armed until the formal moment of laying down weapons, maintaining military discipline that impressed even Allied observers. Of the 15,000 troops Manteuffel had commanded when he arrived in Tunisia, 72% survived to surrender, a ratio that statistics said should have been impossible given the intensity of fighting and the hopelessness of final situation. Comparable German units in Tunisia suffered 69% casualties. Manteuffel's elastic defense, his willingness to trade ground for lives and ignore orders that served no purpose except satisfying Hitler's fantasies, had saved perhaps 6,000 soldiers who would have died if someone more conventionally obedient had commanded them. The evacuation from Tunisia brought one of the war's more remarkable moments, though it was barely documented at the time. May 13th, as the sun set on German operations in North Africa, the last boats departing the continent for Sicily carried wounded and essential personnel. Manteuffel could have been on one of those boats. His rank and position entitled him to evacuation priority. Senior officers were being pulled out to preserve their expertise for future campaigns. But Manteuffel remained on the beach, personally counting his men aboard, ensuring the most seriously wounded got spaces before walking wounded, making certain that evacuation proceeded in order that prioritized those who needed help most rather than those whose rank demanded privilege. He boarded the last boat, quite literally, standing at the gangplank as Stuka dive bombers screamed overhead and Allied artillery searched for targets along the coast. This was pure Manteuffel, the gesture that defined his relationship with soldiers under his command. He would accept no privilege he did not share, no safety he had not ensured for his men first. The aristocratic generals he had always resented would have been on the first boats out. Manteuffel was on the last. The post-evacuation period allowed Manteuffel to document systematically what he had learned about conducting retreats under impossible conditions. His after-action report, preserved in German military archives and later studied by military historians, amounted to a complete manual for how to lose slowly against superior forces, how to conduct night movements that avoided enemy air power, how to establish successive defensive positions that channeled enemy advances into kill zones while maintaining escape routes for defenders, how to time withdrawals so that ammunition and fuel were expended efficiently rather than abandoned, how to maintain unit cohesion during retreats when panic and dissolution were the natural responses to constant pressure, how to make elastic defense appear like fierce resistance in reports to superiors who demanded impossible stands. It was, in its way, as revolutionary as his pre-war innovations in tank warfare. Manteuffel had created a doctrine for the losing side, systematic approaches to preserving combat power during strategic defeat. But Tunisia taught lessons darker than tactical. Manteuffel had discovered that he could no longer obey orders blindly, that his duty to soldiers required judgment about when orders should be followed and when they should be creatively reinterpreted. This was treasonous thinking by Wehrmacht standards, where obedience was absolute and orders were orders regardless of sensibility. Manteuffel had crossed a line in Tunisia, choosing to save men over satisfying Hitler's delusions, and that crossing changed him fundamentally. He would continue to serve. He would continue to achieve tactical excellence. But he would serve with internal reservations that would only grow as the war situation deteriorated. Tunisia was where Manteuffel became something more complex than a brilliant tactical commander. He became a man trying to practice morality within immoral circumstances, trying to save what could be saved from catastrophe he had no power to prevent. The master of retreat, the general who could lose more slowly than anyone else, was actually something more important. He was a commander who valued human life over propaganda victories, who understood that soldiers' lives mattered more than Führer fantasies. And in the final years of the war, that understanding would guide decisions that saved thousands of lives while technically violating orders that demanded their sacrifice. Tunisia was the education. Russia had broken his faith in German strategy. Tunisia taught him that keeping faith with soldiers sometimes required breaking faith with commanders, and that lesson would shape everything that followed in the terrible years ahead. September 16, 1944, Wolf's Lair, East Prussia. General der Panzertruppen Hasso von Manteuffel stood in Adolf Hitler's conference room, one of perhaps 20 senior officers summoned for a briefing on what was being described as Germany's last great offensive in the West. The atmosphere was surreal, combining the bunker's physical oppression, all concrete and artificial light deep underground, with the psychological oppression of Hitler's presence, the dictator's magnetic intensity that could still compel even when his strategic judgment had been proven catastrophically wrong repeatedly. Hitler was explaining his vision, and what Manteuffel heard confirmed his worst fears about German command continuing to mistake fantasy for planning. Germany would launch a massive armored offensive through the Ardennes forest, exactly as they had done in May 1940, splitting Allied forces and driving to capture the port of Antwerp within 7 days. This would cut off British and Canadian armies in the north, force the Western Allies to negotiate peace, and allow Germany to focus all resources on the Eastern Front, where the Soviet advance threatened the Reich itself. Manteuffel listened with the expression of professional attention he had perfected over years of enduring strategic insanity while maintaining tactical competence. But internally, he was conducting rapid calculations that revealed the plan's fatal flaws. The Ardennes worked in 1940 because Allied forces were unprepared, poorly positioned, and led by commanders who did not expect German armor to traverse forest terrain. None of those conditions existed in late 1944. Allied forces were alert, well-supplied, and commanded by officers who had learned hard lessons. The idea that Germany could achieve surprise through the Ardennes again defied every principle of military planning. Moreover, the fuel requirements alone made the operation impossible. German panzer divisions needed approximately 500,000 gallons of fuel per day during sustained offensive operations. Hitler's plan called for capturing Allied fuel dumps to sustain the advance. This was not planning, it was hoping that the enemy would conveniently solve your logistical problems. Manteuffel had seen this pattern before in Russia. Grand visions disconnected from mathematics. Operations that worked on maps but collapsed when fuel trucks could not. Reach forward units. The briefing continued with Hitler assigning forces to various commands, and here Manteuffel received simultaneously the opportunity and the curse that would define the war's final months. He would command Fifth Panzer Army, approximately 120,000 troops and 400 tanks, the largest formation he had ever led. His assigned sector was the southern portion of the Ardennes Offensive, responsible for driving west toward the Meuse River crossings, while 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich had the main effort to the north. The assignment was recognition of Manteuffel's tactical brilliance, acknowledgement that he was among Germany's most capable commanders. But it was also a trap, tasking him to execute a plan he immediately recognized as fundamentally flawed, giving him insufficient resources for impossible objectives, all while serving under strategic direction that had consistently demonstrated contempt for logistical reality. Hitler's plan called for attacks to begin at 11 o'clock in the morning, after massive artillery preparation, the traditional German approach of shock and awe, designed to paralyze defenders before armored assault. Manteuffel understood instantly that this violated every principle of tactical surprise. Morning attacks in December meant launching in daylight when Allied aircraft could immediately spot German movements. Artillery preparation lasting hours would warn every Allied unit in the sector that major assault was coming. By the time panzers actually moved forward, surprise would be completely lost, and Allied defenders would be alert and ready. This was World War I thinking applied to mobile warfare, and it would fail exactly as such approaches had always failed when commanders prioritized dramatics over effectiveness. Manteuffel said nothing during the briefing, but his mind was already formulating alternatives, modifications that might salvage tactical success from strategic stupidity. October brought weeks of preparation during which Manteuffel carefully built his case for modifying Hitler's plan. He could not directly oppose the offensive that would result in immediate relief from command and replacement with someone more compliant but less competent. Instead, he presented his modifications as tactical improvements that served Hitler's strategic vision more effectively. Attack at 5:30 in the morning, 90 minutes before dawn, not at 11 o'clock in daylight. This would give German forces crucial hours of darkness to infiltrate American positions before air power could intervene. Eliminate the preliminary bombardment entirely, achieving complete surprise through silent infiltration, just as he had done in France. Modify objectives from Antwerp, which was militarily impossible, to the Meuse River crossings, which was merely extremely difficult. Present these changes not as contradicting the Führer, but as tactical refinements that would ensure success of the Führer's brilliant strategic conception. The November meeting where Manteuffel presented his modifications to Hitler was the most dangerous moment of his career. Other officers had been relieved, arrested, even executed for less direct contradiction of Hitler's plans. But Manteuffel had two advantages. First, his reputation for tactical excellence was by now undeniable, even to regime loyalists. Second, he presented his case with mathematical precision that appealed to Hitler's self-image as strategic genius. Manteuffel did not say Hitler's plan was wrong. He said that tactical modifications would make Hitler's plan work better. He did not criticize the Antwerp objective. He suggested reaching the Meuse first would create the conditions for subsequent advance to Antwerp. He spoke in terms of fuel consumption rates, road network capacity, and achievable daily advance rates, burying criticism in technical details that made opposition seem like helping Hitler achieve what Hitler wanted to achieve. It was a masterful performance of manipulation, disguised as loyal subordination. Hitler's response was characteristic of his combination of megalomania and occasional tactical shrewdness. He raged at Manteuffel for doubting the offensive's feasibility, accusing him of defeatism and lack of will, but he also recognized competence when presented with it, and he was cunning enough to understand that Manteuffel's modifications might work where the original plan would fail. The compromise reached gave Manteuffel operational flexibility within strategic parameters that remained unrealistic. Fifth Panzer Army could attack at 5:30 in the morning with silent infiltration. It could execute tactics according to Manteuffel's judgment, but ultimate objectives remained Antwerp and total Allied collapse. Manteuffel accepted this devil's bargain because it was the only one available. He would execute a plan he knew was strategically doomed, using tactical methods that might achieve local success. It was the story of his entire career in microcosm: brilliance in service to futility, excellence that prolonged defeat rather than achieving victory. December 1st through 15th brought frantic preparations as Manteuffel assembled and positioned his forces. The challenges were enormous and revealed how far German military capacity had declined since the confident years of Blitzkrieg. His tank divisions were at perhaps 60% authorized strength, equipped with a mixture of Panther and Panzer IV tanks that were individually superior to most Allied armor, but suffered from mechanical unreliability Germany's collapsing industrial base could no longer address. Fuel allocation was 40% below minimum operational requirements, with promises that captured Allied supplies would make up the difference, the same fantasy that had doomed Barbarossa. Personnel replacements included 16-year-old boys and 45-year-old men, conscripts from occupied territories with questionable loyalty, veterans of the Eastern Front who brought experience but also deep exhaustion and psychological trauma. Yet Manteuffel transformed this collection of inadequate resources into something formidable through the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his entire career. He personally selected attack routes, spending nights driving through the Ardennes to identify roads that could support tank columns. He established elaborate security measures to prevent Allied intelligence from detecting the buildup, moving formations only at night and enforcing radio silence so complete that even internal German communications were conducted by courier motorcycle. He drilled his commanders relentlessly on the tactical plan, ensuring every officer understood their role, their objectives, their contingencies if things went wrong, and he prepared his soldiers psychologically, explaining that this was Germany's last chance to change the war's trajectory, that their family's survival depended on making one supreme effort succeed where previous efforts had failed. It was partly truth, partly manipulation, but it was what soldiers needed to hear to commit to an offensive that tactical experts like Manteuffel privately understood would ultimately fail. The final commanders' meeting on December the 15th revealed the stark contrast between Manteuffel's approach and that of Sepp Dietrich, commanding 6th SS Panzer Army to the north. Dietrich, the former butcher who had risen through SS ranks based on political loyalty and thuggish brutality, presented a plan that was pure frontal assault. Artillery bombardment, tank charges, infantry following behind, the same tactics the German army had used with decreasing effectiveness since Stalingrad. When questioned about fuel, Dietrich waved concerns away with assurances that German will would overcome material limitations. When asked about Allied air power, he promised that bad weather would ground enemy aircraft. His plan was hope disguised as strategy, fantasy presented as operational planning. Manteuffel listened and said nothing, understanding that Dietrich's failure would be 5th Panzer Army's opportunity. While the SS battered itself against alerted American positions, Manteuffel's silent infiltration might actually achieve the breakthroughs that strategy demanded. As Manteuffel returned to his command post after that final meeting, he understood completely the tragic position he occupied. He had taken Hitler's impossible plan and modified it into something that might work tactically while remaining strategically doomed. He would command brilliantly, his soldiers would fight courageously, and none of it would matter because Germany lacked the resources to sustain offensive operations, even if initial success was achieved. The Ardennes would be his masterpiece and his monument to futility, the perfect execution of a flawed plan. Tactical genius wasted on strategic insanity. Everything he had feared since Verdun, everything he had witnessed in Russia, everything Tunisia had taught him about the gap between high command fantasy and ground truth, would be demonstrated one final time in the forests of Belgium. The man who almost won was about to attempt the impossible, knowing it was impossible, doing it anyway because that was what duty and professionalism demanded. And because somewhere in the complexity of his moral calculations, Manteuffel still believed that tactical excellence that saved soldiers' lives was meaningful even when serving strategic stupidity that ultimately wasted those lives. December 16th, 1944, was hours away. The ghost general was about to attempt his greatest performance, and history would barely remember his name even as it studied his achievement. December 16th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. Absolute darkness blanketed the Ardennes forest as Hasso von Manteuffel's Fifth Panzer Army began moving forward in silence, so complete it seemed unnatural. No artillery preparation, no engine roaring, just the quiet rumble of tanks at low throttle, the muffled crunch of infantry boots on frozen ground, and the whispered commands passed through units that had rehearsed this moment dozens of times. 90 minutes before dawn, 90 minutes before Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army would announce its presence with massive bombardment that would wake every American soldier from the English Channel to Switzerland. Manteuffel's modifications to Hitler's plan were now being tested under conditions where failure meant not just tactical defeat, but the final squandering of Germany's last mobile reserves. In American positions barely 300 meters away, soldiers of the 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived in what they had been assured was a quiet sector for training and rest, had no idea they were about to experience tactical perfection. The contrast between 5th Panzer Army's sector and 6th Panzer Army's sector in those first critical hours would determine the entire offensive's trajectory. At 7 o'clock, when dawn barely lightened the eastern sky, Dietrich's attack began with artillery bombardment that could be heard 50 kilometers away, thousands of guns announcing German presence and intentions with deafening clarity. American units in that sector, alerted by the bombardment, manned defensive positions, called for reinforcements, prepared for the assault they knew was coming. The result was exactly what Manteuffel had predicted: fierce fighting, heavy casualties on both sides, minimal German penetration. SS Panzer divisions battered themselves against alerted defenders, achieving perhaps 5 kilometers of advance at enormous cost. Meanwhile, in Manteuffel's sector, American command posts were being overrun before radio operators could transmit warnings. Entire battalions found themselves surrounded by German forces that had appeared from nowhere. Defensive positions prepared for frontal assault discovered enemy troops behind them, having infiltrated through gaps in darkness that daylight reconnaissance would have revealed. By 8 o'clock in the morning, just 2.5 hours after the attack began, the disparity was undeniable to anyone with access to reports from both sectors. 5th Panzer Army had penetrated 15 kilometers into American positions, captured over 2,000 prisoners, and overrun dozens of supply dumps and artillery positions whose crews never received warning of approaching danger. 6th Panzer Army, despite having priority for resources and being assigned the main effort, had barely advanced beyond American forward positions and was already reporting heavy casualties from defensive fire that had hours to prepare. Manteuffel's tactical modifications, the dawn attack without preparation, the silent infiltration, the personally scouted routes that avoided American strongpoints, had achieved in hours what Dietrich's conventional approach failed to accomplish in days. It was vindication of everything Manteuffel had argued about: surprise and stealth versus shock and awe. But it was also the beginning of tragedy, because tactical perfection could not overcome strategic impossibility. The seizure of St. Vith became the operational key that unlocked 5th Panzer Army's advance and simultaneously revealed the campaign's fatal weakness. St. Vith was a road junction town where 7 major routes converged, the kind of terrain feature that armored forces needed to maintain momentum. American defenders, recognizing St. Vith's importance, rushed reinforcements to hold it, even as German pincers closed around the position. Manteuffel's 116th Panzer Division and elements of the 18th Volksgrenadier Division surrounded St. Vith by December 17th, establishing a siege that should have ended in hours if German advantages in armor and artillery could be brought to bear. But the siege dragged on for 4 critical days. 4 days when 5th Panzer Army's spearheads sat immobilized waiting for roads through St. Vith to open. 4 days consuming fuel reserves that could never be replaced. American defenders at St. Vith, outnumbered and surrounded, held on through courage and desperation, not knowing their resistance was buying time for Allied reinforcements to arrive and for German logistics to collapse. December 18th brought Manteuffel's deepest penetration, the moment when tactical success came tantalizingly close to achieving operational breakthrough. His 116th Panzer Division, having bypassed St. Vith to the south, reached Houffalize and continued driving west toward the Meuse River crossings that were Manteuffel's modified objective. Lead reconnaissance elements reported they were 35 kilometers from the Meuse, 45 kilometers from Dinant, where Manteuffel had achieved crossing in France 4 years earlier. Maps at his command post showed the penetration as a salient driven deep into American positions, exactly the kind of operational success that German armored doctrine was designed to achieve. For a brief moment, the impossible seemed possible, that tactical brilliance might actually overcome strategic limitations, that Manteuffel's modifications had created the conditions for success that Hitler's original plan could never have achieved, that the ghost general might actually pull off the greatest upset of the entire war. But December 19th brought reality in the form of fuel gauges approaching empty and supply columns that were not arriving. Manteuffel's meticulous logistics planning had allocated fuel based on optimistic assumptions about capture of American supplies and about supply roads remaining open through captured territory. Neither assumption held. American forces, while retreating, systematically destroyed fuel dumps rather than allowing them to fall into German hands. Supply convoys trying to reach Fifth Panzer Army's spearheads found roads clogged with traffic jams, created by 6th Panzer Army units that had priority for road space, despite achieving nothing with it. The elaborate German logistics system, always the weak point in armored operations, was collapsing exactly as it had collapsed in Russia, for exactly the same reasons. Tactical units had advanced faster than support elements could follow, distance and disorder had broken the supply chain, and now, panzer divisions sat immobilized within sight of objectives they lacked fuel to reach. Manteuffel spent December 19th in his command vehicle, making calculations that were part mathematics, part tragic prophecy. His panzer divisions had perhaps one more day of combat operations on remaining fuel. After that, they would be immobilized defensive positions rather than mobile striking forces. The Meuse River crossings were 8 kilometers away for his leading elements, tantalizingly close, but might as well have been 800 kilometers given fuel constraints. American reinforcements, he knew from intelligence reports, were arriving in strength. Patton's Third Army was turning north to strike Fifth Panzer Army's southern flank. British forces were moving south to reinforce the northern sector. The window of opportunity that tactical surprise had opened was slamming shut, and Manteuffel lacked the resources to wedge it back open. The perfect attack was becoming the perfect failure, not because of tactical mistakes, but because strategy had demanded more than logistics could deliver. December 20th brought the order Manteuffel had dreaded since the offensive began. Halt offensive operations. Consolidate gains. Prepare for defensive operations. It was admission of strategic failure, wrapped in operational language that tried to disguise defeat as adjustment. Fifth Panzer Army had advanced 45 kilometers in 4 days, achieved penetration that no other German force would match for the rest of the war, demonstrated that tactical excellence still existed in Wehrmacht despite overall strategic collapse. And none of it mattered because Antwerp remained 120 kilometers away. The Meuse remained uncrossed, and Allied forces were recovering from their initial surprise with the massive material advantages that Germany could never match. Manteuffel's modifications had transformed impossible into merely very difficult. But very difficult was still failure when strategic objectives required impossible. The statistics told the story that official reports tried to obscure. Fifth Panzer Army had inflicted over 8,000 American casualties in its sector during the first 5 days of the offensive. It had captured 12,000 prisoners, hundreds of vehicles, and enough supplies to partially offset logistics failures. It had achieved penetration of 45 kilometers compared to 6th Panzer Army's 15 kilometers, despite having fewer resources and lower priority. By every tactical metric, Manteuffel had executed brilliantly. By every strategic metric, he had failed completely because tactical brilliance could not compensate for strategic impossibility. The man who almost won had demonstrated one final time that almost was the saddest word in military vocabulary. That perfection in execution meant nothing when the plan itself was doomed. That you could do everything right and still lose when strategic fundamentals worked against you. But the human cost exceeded any statistical analysis. Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army suffered approximately 6,000 casualties in those first 5 days. Soldiers killed or wounded in service to an offensive that Manteuffel had known from the beginning could not achieve its stated objectives. Every casualty report that crossed his desk represented a life ended or shattered for a cause that was already lost, sacrificed to maintain momentum toward objectives that fuel shortages made unreachable. The moral burden of this, of commanding brilliantly in service to futility, of ordering men to die for goals he knew were unattainable, weighed on Manteuffel in ways that outsiders could never understand. He had done his duty as defined by professional military standards. He had executed orders with competence that approached perfection. And in doing so, he had participated in the squandering of Germany's last mobile reserves, ensuring that future defensive operations would lack resources that this offensive consumed to no strategic purpose. As December 20th turned to 21st, and Fifth Panzer Army transitioned from attack to defense, Manteuffel understood that the Ardennes Offensive would become historical footnote, remembered more for American response than German achievement. That his perfect attack, the tactical masterpiece that demonstrated everything right about his methods, would be overshadowed by strategic failure that demonstrated everything wrong about German command. That history would remember the Battle of the Bulge as American defensive triumph rather than as German tactical excellence wasted on impossible objectives. The ghost general, who had modified Hitler's plan into something that nearly worked, would remain ghost in historical memory, his name unknown to most people who studied the battle, his achievements attributed to Wehrmacht, generally rather than to his innovations, specifically. He had achieved tactical perfection in the Ardennes. He had demonstrated that surprise, stealth, and meticulous preparation could still overcome material disadvantage. And none of it would matter, because tactical perfection, however magnificent, could not overcome strategic insanity. The perfect attack had proven the imperfection of the cause it served. And Manteuffel, the reluctant warrior who had become disillusioned warrior and was now becoming tragic warrior, understood that everything from this moment forward would be managing defeat, not achieving victory. The Ardennes was the high water mark. Everything after would be retreat, collapse, and the desperate effort to save what could be saved from catastrophe that strategic incompetence had guaranteed. The man who almost won had run out of almost. Now came the reckoning. December 19th, 1944, evening. Hasso von Manteuffel stared at the map where a single town name glowed like an accusation in the dim light of his command post. Bastogne, a road junction in southern Belgium where 7 highways converged. American defenders had retreated into the town as German forces swept past. And now that garrison represented a problem that Manteuffel had spent his entire career learning to solve through bypass and infiltration rather than frontal assault. His 47th Panzer Corps, spearheading the advance toward the Meuse, had reached Bastogne's outskirts on December 18th, recognized it as isolated American, positioned surrounded by German-controlled territory, and done exactly what mobile warfare doctrine dictated. They had contained it with minimal forces and continued driving west toward objectives that actually mattered. This was textbook armored operations, the kind of decision that separated professional commanders from amateurs. And now, Hitler's headquarters was overruling it with orders that would waste the few days remaining before fuel exhaustion ended all offensive capability. The order arrived in bureaucratic language that failed to disguise its strategic stupidity. Bastogne must be taken. All available forces will reduce this position before continuing the advance. Manteuffel read it 3 times, hoping somehow the words would rearrange themselves into something sensible, then composed his response with the careful phrasing of someone who had learned how to express disagreement without triggering Führer rage. Bastogne was operationally irrelevant to Fifth Panzer Army's main axis of advance, he explained. American defenders there posed no threat to German supply lines, which ran north and south of the town. The garrison was isolated, cut off from reinforcement or resupply, slowly being starved into submission by siege rather than costly assault. Allocating major combat forces to reduce Bastogne when those forces were needed to exploit the breakthrough toward the Meuse was exchanging operational advantage for tactical symbolism. Every day spent on Bastogne was a day American reinforcements moved into blocking positions further west. The recommendation was maintain light containment, continue the westward drive, return to deal with Bastogne after securing the Meuse crossings. Hitler's response came within hours, and it demonstrated everything Manteuffel had learned to hate about German strategic decision-making. Bastogne must fall because road junctions must be controlled, because American resistance must be crushed wherever encountered, because will and determination would overcome logistical constraints that defeatist generals exaggerated. The order was not a suggestion, but an ultimatum. Commit the 47th Panzer Corps to reducing Bastogne immediately, or face relief from command. It was World War I thinking applied to World War II warfare, the belief that seizing terrain features on maps mattered more than maintaining operational momentum. It was also deeply personal to Hitler, who viewed any American resistance as insult requiring punishment rather than obstacle to be bypassed. Manteuffel recognized all this, understood the futility of further argument, and prepared to waste men and time on an objective that would contribute nothing to operational success. December 20th brought the initial assaults against Bastogne that revealed why Manteuffel had wanted to bypass it. American defenders, the 101st Airborne Division reinforced with armor and artillery units that had retreated into the perimeter, had transformed the town into a fortress that negated German advantages in mobile warfare. Urban terrain channeled attacks into killing zones. American artillery, which had been mobile liability during retreat, became devastating defensive asset when protecting static positions. The close quarters eliminated German armor advantages, reducing tanks to slow-moving targets for American bazookas and anti-tank guns. Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's best equipped and most experienced armored formations, battered itself against Bastogne's defenses for 2 days and achieved penetration measured in hundreds of meters at cost, measured in hundreds of casualties. The attack was consuming precisely the resources that Manteuffel needed for the westward drive, validating every concern he had expressed. December 22nd brought the famous episode that would become Bastogne legend, though Manteuffel viewed it with weary recognition of the propaganda value that exceeded military significance. German officers delivered surrender ultimatum to American commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, predicting destruction of the garrison if terms were not accepted. McAuliffe's one-word reply, "nuts," became celebrated example of American defiance that newspapers on both sides covered extensively. From Manteuffel's perspective, it was theater masking military reality. The surrender demand was Hitler's idea, not his, part of the Führer's obsession with demonstrating German will. McAuliffe's refusal changed nothing about the tactical situation. Bastogne remained surrounded, under siege, slowly being ground down. The garrison's morale was impressive, but morale did not create ammunition or food that American defenders were consuming faster than could be resupplied. Manteuffel cared nothing about propaganda victories or demonstrative gestures. He cared about the 6 days being wasted on Bastogne, when those 6 days represented the margin between reaching the Meuse and strategic failure. December 26th brought catastrophe that Manteuffel had predicted with mathematical precision. Patton's Third Army, driving north at forced march speed, smashed through German encirclement and established ground corridor into Bastogne. The siege was broken. American defenders were resupplied and reinforced. The town that Hitler insisted must be captured immediately was now permanently denied to German forces as more Allied units poured into the salient. But the strategic damage exceeded merely failing to take one town. The 6 days spent on Bastogne, December 20th through 26th, were exactly the 6 days when Fifth Panzer Army still had fuel to reach the Meuse. Manteuffel's staff officers conducted post-analysis that confirmed what their commander already knew. If the 47th Panzer Corps had continued westward instead of turning south toward Bastogne, lead elements would have reached Meuse crossing sites by December 23rd. If Panzer Lehr Division had been committed to exploiting breakthrough instead of assaulting urban fortifications, bridgeheads across the river were achievable by Christmas Day. The window of opportunity that Manteuffel's perfect tactical execution had opened, Hitler's obsession with Bastogne had slammed shut. The mathematical analysis was brutally clear. Fifth Panzer Army committed approximately 30,000 troops and 200 tanks to operations around Bastogne between December 20th and 26th. Those forces, if committed to the main axis, represented sufficient combat power to overcome American delaying positions between the German spearheads and the Meuse. Casualties around Bastogne exceeded 3,000 killed and wounded, losses that achieved zero operational benefit. Fuel consumed in the Bastogne operations, driving tanks in circles around a town instead of in straight lines toward objectives, represented perhaps 40% of 5th Panzer Army's remaining reserves. When analysts calculated what was possible if those resources had been applied to the westward advance, Instead, the conclusions were stunning. The Meuse was reachable. Bridgeheads were establishable. Operational success that would have forced Allied strategic adjustments was achievable. Not ultimate victory, Manteuffel never believed that was possible, but significant success that would have vindicated the offensive's tactical execution, even as its strategic goals remained unattainable. Instead, Bastogne absorbed resources, consumed time, and generated casualties for an objective that was always irrelevant to Fifth Panzer Army's mission. Manteuffel had known this from December 19th, had argued against it, had been overruled by leaders whose understanding of mobile warfare remained trapped in previous wars. The pattern was familiar by now, painfully familiar. Tactical competence sabotaged by strategic incompetence. Local commanders understanding reality, overruled by distant headquarters making decisions based on maps that omitted crucial details like fuel gauges and casualty lists. Manteuffel executing brilliantly, then watching that execution wasted on objectives that served ideology rather than military necessity. He had seen it in Russia, where tactical victories accumulated into strategic defeat because logistics collapsed. He had seen it in Tunisia, where orders to hold positions ignored the impossibility of holding when surrounded by overwhelming force. Now he was seeing it in the Ardennes, where the most perfectly executed tactical offensive on the Western Front was being squandered on a road junction town whose capture or non-capture changed nothing about the offensive's ultimate failure. The Bastogne episode revealed something deeper and darker about Manteuffel's position by late 1944. He was no longer trying to win. He was trying to fail as efficiently as possible, to achieve whatever limited success was attainable with available resources, to preserve forces for the defensive operations that would inevitably follow when offensive momentum collapsed. Bastogne represented the opposite of this philosophy. It was inefficient failure, squandering resources on objectives that did not matter, accepting casualties that achieved nothing, demonstrating that German high command had learned nothing from 3 years of defeats. Manteuffel could not say this openly. To articulate that he was trying to manage decline rather than achieve victory would be defeatism justifying court-martial. But it was implicit in every argument he made about bypassing Bastogne, every calculation showing resource waste, every casualty report documenting losses for zero gain. December 27th found Manteuffel in his command vehicle, composing report for higher headquarters that was exercise in communicating truth through bureaucratic language they might accept. Fifth Panzer Army had achieved significant tactical success, penetrating 45 kilometers in difficult terrain against determined resistance. American forces had demonstrated unexpected resilience, but were still reeling from initial blow. However, current fuel stocks were insufficient for continued offensive operations. Ammunition reserves were below critical thresholds. Casualties had reduced combat strength of key divisions to 50 to 60% of authorized levels. The recommendation, carefully phrased, was consolidate gains, transition to defensive operations, preserve combat capability for future employment. What Manteuffel meant but could not write was simple. The Ardennes Offensive had failed strategically, achieved all that tactical excellence could accomplish against impossible objectives, and continuing to attack would just waste remaining resources on operations that served no military purpose. Stop now. Save what can be saved. Prepare for the retreats that everyone except Hitler understood were inevitable. The response from headquarters confirmed that reality and leadership existed in different universes. Continue offensive operations. The will to victory would overcome material limitations. Bastogne must still be taken regardless of cost. And implicitly, any commander expressing doubt about ultimate success might find themselves replaced by someone with more ideologically correct attitude. Manteuffel read the response and felt something inside him complete its long transformation from professional soldier to tragic prisoner. He was trapped in duty to a regime that demanded impossible achievements, leading soldiers who deserved better into operations that would kill them for no strategic purpose, exercising tactical brilliance in service to strategic insanity that would destroy everything he had tried to preserve. Bastogne's shadow extended far beyond one Belgian town. It represented the fatal flaw in German command that no amount of tactical competence could overcome. The belief that will trumped mathematics, that determination substituted for resources, that ideology could defeat material reality. Manteuffel had spent 5 years demonstrating that tactical excellence could mitigate strategic stupidity, could achieve more with less than anyone thought possible. Bastogne proved the limits of that proposition. That eventually, inevitably, impossibility remained impossible regardless of how brilliantly you attempted it. The man who almost won at Bastogne had been prevented from almost winning by leaders who preferred symbolic gestures to operational success. And the tragedy was that Manteuffel would continue to serve those leaders, continue to execute their flawed orders with his characteristic competence, continue to participate in magnificent failure. Because duty, professional identity, and concern for soldiers under his command left him no alternative he could accept. Bastogne's shadow would follow him through everything that came after, reminder that tactical perfection could not save you when strategy guaranteed defeat. January 3rd, 1945. The order arrived at Fifth Panzer Army headquarters with the bureaucratic phrasing that German command used to disguise admissions of defeat. Prepare for systematic withdrawal to more defensible positions. Hasso von Manteuffel read it without surprise, without disappointment, without anything except weary recognition that the mathematics he had calculated weeks earlier were now being acknowledged by headquarters that had insisted will could overcome arithmetic. The Ardennes Offensive was officially over. Everything from this moment forward would be retreat, the long, slow collapse that Manteuffel had mastered in Russia and Tunisia but had hoped never to conduct on German approaches to the Rhine. His Fifth Panzer Army, which had driven 45 kilometers into American territory through perfect tactical execution, now had to withdraw that same distance while being pursued by enemies who smelled blood and who possessed the material advantages to turn retreat into rout if German forces gave them opportunity. The challenge was unprecedented in Manteuffel's experience because the circumstances were worse than anything he had encountered. In Russia, retreat had been forced by Soviet winter offensive, but German forces maintained some numerical parity and could trade space for time across vast territories. In Tunisia, retreat had been inevitable but limited to compressed terrain, where short withdrawals reached prepared positions. The Ardennes withdrawal faced different mathematics. American forces had numerical superiority of approximately 3-1 in infantry, 5-1 in armor, and 10-1 in artillery. Allied air power, grounded during the offensive's first weeks by bad weather, had returned to skies and was destroying anything German that moved in daylight. Supply lines, already inadequate during the offensive, were now being systematically targeted by fighter bombers that turned every road into shooting gallery. And behind all this stood the Rhine River, the last natural barrier before Germany itself, still 150 kilometers to the east across terrain that offered few defensive advantages. Manteuffel spent January 4th through 6th developing a withdrawal plan that would become the template for German retreat operations through the end of the war. The concept was elastic defense, the same doctrine he had pioneered in Tunisia, but now applied at army level across 6 division fronts. Established defensive positions that appeared strong enough to make Americans pause and prepare for assault. Man those positions with minimum forces, mostly infantry with supporting weapons, while pulling armor and mobile formations back to next defensive line. When American assault came, resist long enough to inflict casualties and impose delay, then withdraw in organized fashion before encirclement could occur. Accept territorial loss to preserve combat power. Trade space for time, ground for lives. Enduring defeat while minimizing its cost. It was doctrine for losers, systematic approach to failing slowly, and it required psychological adjustment from soldiers trained in offensive warfare who equated retreat with failure and dishonor. January 8th brought first test of the elastic defense when American forces launched coordinated assault against 5th Panzer Army positions around Huffelise. The town had no strategic value beyond being temporary German defensive anchor, but Hitler's headquarters ordered it held at all costs. The phrase that Manteuffel had learned meant commanders were supposed to sacrifice soldiers for symbolism. Manteuffel interpreted the order with the creative compliance he had perfected over preceding months. Hold Huffelise with sufficient forces to make American attack costly. Withdraw before encirclement threatened. Report to headquarters that holding Huffelise at all costs meant preserving forces to continue holding subsequent positions rather than sacrificing entire division for one town. It was military sophistry, using the language of obedience to justify disobedience, but it worked because headquarters cared more about receiving reports that sounded aggressive than about operational reality. The fighting around Houffalize demonstrated both the effectiveness of Manteuffel's methods and the inevitability of German defeat. His rear guards, dug into positions that American reconnaissance had identified as main defensive line, fought with skill and determination that impressed even enemies. American infantry attacking Houffalize's outskirts encountered machine gun fire, mortar barrages, and counterattacks that suggested Germans intended serious defense. American commanders paused to bring up armor and artillery, to coordinate airstrikes, to prepare methodical assault that would minimize casualties. This pause was exactly what Manteuffel intended, buying time measured in hours that allowed his main forces to withdraw to kilometers further east. When American assault finally came with overwhelming firepower, it overwhelmed positions that Manteuffel had already evacuated, capturing perhaps 200 German troops who were rearguard volunteers who knew their mission was delay, followed by surrender. By the time American forces secured Houffalize on January 16th, Fifth Panzer Army's main body was establishing new defensive positions 20 kilometers east, having traded one insignificant town for 8 days of delay at cost of casualties that were fraction of what rigid defense would have incurred. February brought the Rhineland fighting that revealed the full horror of Germany's strategic position. Fifth Panzer Army, reinforced with remnants of 6th SS Panzer Army that had been mauled during the Ardennes Offensive, now defended a front stretching from Aachen to Koblenz, approximately 120 kilometers that should have been held by 3 full armies, but was instead held by 1 and half. Manteuffel commanded roughly 90,000 troops. Sounds impressive until compared to over 300,000 American and British forces pressing against them with unlimited air support and artillery that expended more ammunition in 1 day than Germany produced in 1 week. The mathematics made defense impossible in conventional sense. There were not enough German soldiers to man continuous defensive line, not enough ammunition to sustain firefights at American tempo, not enough fuel to move reserves to threatened sectors, not enough of anything except courage and professional competence, neither of which could substitute for missing material. Manteuffel's solution was to abandon continuous defense entirely, replacing it with what he called strong point defense in depth. Instead of trying to hold a line, he established fortified positions at key terrain features, separated by lightly held sectors. When American forces attacked, they encountered fierce resistance at Schirm, strong points that forced them to pause, bring up reinforcements, commit resources to reductions that took days rather than hours. Meanwhile, American advances through lightly held sectors moved into kill zones where German artillery and the few remaining mobile reserves could counterattack. The system was not designed to stop American advance, but to make that advance as expensive and time-consuming as possible, to force Americans to fight for every kilometer, to bleed them slowly, to preserve German combat power while buying time for political leadership that Manteuffel knew would never achieve the negotiated peace they fantasized about. March 7, 1945, brought the Remagen Bridge disaster that demonstrated how tactical brilliance could not compensate when strategic situation was hopeless. American forces, advancing faster than German intelligence anticipated, reached the Rhine at Remagen, where a single railroad bridge still stood intact despite German efforts to destroy everything behind them. In a combination of American initiative and German misfortune, the bridge was captured before demolition charges could destroy it. Suddenly, American forces had bridgehead across the Rhine, the natural barrier that was supposed to buy weeks of defensive time. The bridge was technically in Fifth Panzer Army's sector, making it Manteuffel's responsibility in a way that ignored the reality that he commanded forces stretched too thin to defend everything and that bridge demolitions were engineer responsibility, not combat unit mission. Hitler's headquarters demanded immediate counterattack to destroy the bridgehead. Manteuffel calculated that such counterattack would sacrifice divisions he needed for continued defense, and would fail because American forces were already reinforcing bridgehead faster than Germans could concentrate forces for assault. The compromise Manteuffel implemented demonstrated his evolution from obedient professional to leader who prioritized soldier survival over headquarters fantasies. He organized counterattacks that looked impressive in reports filed with higher headquarters but were actually designed to fail efficiently. German forces would attack American positions at Remagen, engage briefly, inflict token casualties, then withdraw, citing overwhelming American firepower and inability to achieve surprise. The attacks satisfied Berlin's demands for action while avoiding the mass casualties that genuine attempts to destroy Bridgehead would have incurred. Meanwhile, Manteuffel withdrew Fifth Panzer Army's main forces to defensive positions east of the Rhine, quietly ignoring orders to hold West Bank at all costs, because holding meant annihilation, while withdrawing meant preservation of forces for subsequent operations. It was systematic disobedience disguised as tactical adjustments, treasonous compliance that saved thousands of lives by refusing to waste them on missions that could not succeed. March 15th brought casualty analysis that revealed both Manteuffel's success and the unsustainable nature of German defensive operations. Fifth Panzer Army had withdrawn over 150 kilometers from the Ardennes, salient to the Rhine, in 10 weeks of continuous fighting. During that period, American forces in Manteuffel's sector suffered approximately 12,000 casualties while advancing through terrain they should have been able to traverse with minimal opposition. This was testament to Manteuffel's elastic defense, his ability to make retreat more costly for pursuers than for retreating forces. But German casualties during the same period exceeded 21,000, approximately 23% of Fifth Panzer Army's average strength during the withdrawal. The casualty ratio was better than Wehrmacht average of 47% for same period, confirming Manteuffel's methods saved lives. But it was still unsustainable arithmetic where Germany was losing soldiers it could not replace while Allies were accepting casualties they could easily absorb. The retreat also revealed changes in Manteuffel that went beyond tactical doctrine to fundamental questions about duty and morality. In early March, he received order to execute all Allied prisoners taken during recent fighting, part of Hitler's increasingly deranged commands as the regime approached collapse. Manteuffel ignored the order completely, neither acknowledging it nor implementing it, nor even filing it in official records where it might implicate him later. Prisoners were turned over to military police and processed according to Geneva Conventions, as if criminal orders had never been received. When questioned by SS liaison officer about prisoner dispositions, Manteuffel claimed communications difficulties prevented receipt of detailed instructions, and prisoners had already been transferred through normal channels before clarification arrived. It was direct disobedience that could have resulted in execution if different people had been asking questions. But by March 1945, even SS officers recognized that Germany was losing and that being associated with war crimes would have post-war consequences. The conspiracy of silence around orders that no one wanted to execute protected Manteuffel as he protected his prisoners. March 24th brought another hold at all costs order, this time for defensive positions along the Rhine near Wesel. Manteuffel's response demonstrated how far he had moved from the professional soldier who had executed orders without question in Poland 6 years earlier. He read the order, calculated that holding Basel would result in Fifth Panzer Army being encircled and destroyed within 72 hours, and quietly gave subordinate commanders different instructions. Prepare for withdrawal across the Rhine, identify crossing sites and schedule movement, establish defensive positions on East Bank to prevent American pursuit, execute withdrawal on night of March 26th, regardless of orders from higher headquarters. Inform Berlin only after withdrawal completed, presenting it as tactical adjustment forced by enemy action rather than pre-planned operation that contradicted explicit orders. It was outright defiance dressed as circumstantial necessity, commander putting preservation of his army ahead of obedience to regime that was demanding its suicide. The long retreat from Ardennes to Rhine demonstrated everything Manteuffel had learned about managing defeat while serving regime that refused to admit defeat was happening. He had preserved combat capability through systematic withdrawal when orders demanded suicidal stands. He had saved soldiers' lives by interpreting orders creatively rather than literally. He had maintained professional competence while privately understanding that competence only prolonged inevitable catastrophe. The casualty statistics proved his methods worked. Fifth, Panzer Army's 23% loss rate during the retreat was better than any comparable German formation during the same period. Manteuffel had executed the most efficient losing campaign possible, demonstrating that tactical genius could minimize but not prevent strategic failure. But the human cost exceeded any statistical celebration. 21,000 casualties, most of them young conscripts barely trained, sacrificed in retreat that everyone except Hitler acknowledged was necessary. Thousands of soldiers who survived only because Manteuffel disobeyed suicidal orders, but who were killed or wounded following orders that were merely catastrophic rather than impossible. The long retreat was Manteuffel's triumph of professionalism and his tragedy of complicity. He had done everything possible to save what could be saved, and everything possible was still inadequate when strategy guaranteed disaster. The ghost general, who had almost won in the Ardennes, was now the ghost general, managing defeat in the Rhineland. Same brilliance, different objective, no less tragic for being expertly executed. April 1st, 1945. Hasso von Manteuffel assumed command of Third Panzer Army with the weary recognition of a man being handed a losing lottery ticket and asked to make it pay out. The army existed primarily on organizational charts maintained by staffs hundreds of kilometers behind the collapsing front. Units that headquarters insisted comprised combat-ready formations, but which Manteuffel knew from experience were shadows of their authorized strength. His initial briefing revealed the full scope of the illusion. Third Panzer Army was assigned 55,000 troops on paper, perhaps 30,000 actually present for duty, and of those 30,000, maybe 20,000, were combat-effective soldiers rather than teenage conscripts who had received weeks of training instead of months, or old men pulled from reserve units who lacked the physical capacity for sustained operations, or foreign conscripts from occupied territories whose loyalty was questionable at best. The equipment situation was worse. Tank battalions that should have had 40 to 50 vehicles reported 8 or 10 operational machines. Artillery regiments listed impressive numbers of guns that close inspection revealed were horse-drawn World War I models being operated by crews who had never fired them in combat. The strategic situation made the personnel and equipment shortages almost irrelevant because no amount of resources could have held what Hitler was demanding Manteuffel defend. Third Panzer Army's assigned sector stretched from the Baltic coast south to Frankfurt on the Oder, approximately 150 kilometers of front that should have been held by 3 full armies with proper reserves and prepared defensive positions. Instead, Manteuffel commanded defenders spread so thinly that each soldier was responsible for defending 5 meters of front line, creating gaps that were not weaknesses in the defensive system, but rather evidence there was no defensive system. Intelligence reports, increasingly fragmentary as German reconnaissance capabilities collapsed, indicated Soviet forces massing opposite Third Panzer Army numbered over 600,000 troops, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft that operated with impunity in skies where the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as meaningful force. The mathematics were not challenging, they were impossible. April 4th brought the order that confirmed Manteuffel's worst fears about regime leadership's complete detachment from reality. Third Panzer Army will defend Berlin approaches to the last bullet. No retreat. Every position held to the last man. Victory or death. The order was signed by Hitler personally, emphasizing that deviation would be considered treason, justifying immediate execution. Manteuffel read it multiple times, searching for language that might permit flexible interpretation, and found none. This was unambiguous demand for suicide defense, that Third Panzer Army should sacrifice itself completely in battles that could delay Soviet advance by perhaps 2 weeks before numerical superiority simply crushed resistance, regardless of German determination. 2 weeks purchased at cost of 30,000 soldiers, killed or captured, served no strategic purpose because Germany had lost the war months ago, and everyone except Hitler and his inner circle acknowledged this. The order demanded Manteuffel orchestrate mass death for no military objective, except satisfying Führer fantasy that will could overcome reality. Manteuffel's response revealed how completely his evolution from obedient professional to moral actor had progressed. He composed official reply accepting the mission with language that suggested enthusiastic compliance, while preparing actual operational plans that systematically violated every aspect of Hitler's order. The official response promised Third Panzer Army would defend to last bullet, would hold every position, would make Berlin approaches into graveyard for Soviet forces. The actual orders Manteuffel issued to subordinate commanders, delivered verbally through trusted officers who would not commit treason to paper, were completely different. Established defensive positions that appeared strong but were designed to be abandoned. conduct fighting withdrawals that looked like fierce resistance in reports but were actually phased retreats, preserve combat capability above all other considerations, withdraw before encirclement threatened, regardless of orders from higher headquarters, save your soldiers because regime leadership had abandoned them to ideological fantasy. It was comprehensive conspiracy to disobey, systematic plan to lose slowly while pretending to resist fiercely, operational treason committed by army commander who had decided duty to soldiers, superseded duty to government. April 10th brought Manteuffel's attempt to present rational alternative to suicidal defense, though he understood the proposal would be rejected before he submitted it. Using secure phone line to OKW headquarters, Manteuffel outlined fighting withdrawal strategy that would preserve 3rd Panzer Army as coherent force while trading space for time. Instead of holding fixed positions until destroyed, conduct elastic defense that imposed maximum delay on Soviet advance while maintaining German combat capability. Instead of sacrificing army defending Berlin, use that army to establish defensive positions on Elbe River, where meeting with Western Allied forces might create political conditions for negotiated settlement. Instead of dying for kilometers of terrain that served no purpose except symbolic, fight intelligently to preserve force that might matter in post-war political calculations. The proposal demonstrated everything Manteuffel had learned about mobile defense, about preserving forces under pressure, about turning inevitable defeat into something less than total catastrophe. The rejection came within hours, delivered with threats that were remarkable for their explicitness, even by standards of regime that routinely executed officers for insufficient fanaticism. Manteuffel's proposal was defeatist thinking that undermined national will. Any commander suggesting withdrawal rather than resistance to last man was demonstrating weakness that justified immediate relief. 3rd Panzer Army would defend Berlin approaches, or 3rd Panzer Army would be commanded by someone who understood that victory required proper ideological attitude regardless of material circumstances. And implicitly, the threat that hung over every Wehrmacht officer by April 1945, that questioning orders might result in arrest by SS, trial by People's Court, and execution by hanging with wire. Manteuffel understood he had approached the limit of what regime would tolerate. Further open opposition would result in his removal, likely his death, and his replacement by true believer who would waste soldiers' lives with enthusiasm rather than reluctance. He backed down from official opposition while privately reinforcing his conspiracy to disobey. April 16th brought the Soviet offensive that everyone had known was coming, but which shocked through its overwhelming scale. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the sky east of Berlin erupted with artillery barrage that survivors would describe as apocalyptic. Over 9,000 Soviet guns, more artillery than existed in entire Wehrmacht by this stage, fired simultaneously in bombardment that could be heard 100 kilometers away. Manteuffel's defensive positions, thinly manned trenches that were defensive line in name only, disappeared under explosions that turned earth into liquid, that buried soldiers alive, that destroyed communications and created casualties in numbers that could not be counted because survivors were too stunned to compile reports. The barrage lasted 90 minutes, longer than some battles, churning 3rd Panzer Army's forward positions into moonscape, where coherent defense became impossible. Then came the tanks, hundreds of Soviet T-34s advancing in waves that simply overwhelmed positions through mass, accepting casualties because they possessed reserves to replace losses, while Germany did not. By April 17th, 3rd Panzer Army's defensive line existed only on maps at headquarters that received no updated information because radio communications had collapsed. Reality on the ground was chaos as Soviet forces achieved penetrations, measured in kilometers, creating gaps that German reserves that existed in planning documents but not in reality, were supposed to counterattack and close. Manteuffel's command structure fragmented into isolated pockets of resistance, led by company commanders who made decisions without higher guidance because higher guidance could not reach them through communications breakdown. The elastic defense Manteuffel had planned, which required coordination and timing to execute properly, degraded into individual units making independent decisions about when to fight and when to withdraw. Some held longer than sensible and were destroyed. Some withdrew earlier than necessary and exposed adjacent positions. The fog of war became absolute blindness as Soviet numerical superiority simply overwhelmed German capacity to maintain operational coherence. April 20th, Hitler's birthday and traditionally a day of military celebration in Nazi Germany, brought Manteuffel's quiet rebellion to its culmination. Using secure phone line that Soviet advance had not yet severed, he issued orders that contradicted everything Hitler demanded, but reflected everything Manteuffel's experience taught about preserving soldiers in hopeless situations. All units would withdraw when encirclement threatened, authorization granted in advance without requiring approval from higher headquarters. Commanders would use initiative to preserve their forces, rather than sacrificing them for terrain that served no purpose. Soldiers' lives had priority over holding positions. This amounted to blanket permission to retreat, standing order that negated every hold at all costs directive from Berlin. It was treason articulated as operational guidance, mutiny disguised as tactical flexibility, and it was necessary because Manteuffel had decided his duty to men under his command superseded his oath to regime that was demanding their pointless deaths. The results of Manteuffel's conspiracy became apparent over following days as Third Panzer Army conducted fighting withdrawal that looked like collapse in Soviet reports, but was actually more organized than any German retreat during final months of war. Units withdrew in phases, maintaining contact with adjacent formations, conducting rearguard, actions that delayed Soviet pursuit without becoming suicidal stands. Officers made decisions that preserved combat capability rather than satisfied ideological demands for resistance, regardless of cost. Soldiers surrendered to Western Allied forces when possible, rather than fight to death against Soviets, understanding that post-war survival probability was higher in American or British captivity. By April 25th, Third Panzer Army had ceased to exist as coherent formation, but its soldiers had not been sacrificed in Berlin's defense as Hitler demanded. They had withdrawn, surrendered, or joined refugee columns fleeing west. They had survived when regime leadership wanted them to die for symbolism. April 29th brought the final disintegration of command structure as Soviet forces closed on Berlin from all directions, and German units dissolved into fragments seeking any route west. Manteuffel maintained contact with perhaps 30% of his nominal command, the rest having either been destroyed, surrendered, or simply disappeared into chaos that characterized Germany's final collapse. His command post was barely distinguishable from refugee collection point, soldiers mixing with civilians, vehicles running on fumes, communications consisting of runners on foot or bicycle bringing fragmentary reports hours out of date. Yet even in this chaos, Manteuffel continued executing the conspiracy he had initiated weeks earlier. Every decision prioritized soldier survival over mission accomplishment. Every order emphasized withdrawal over resistance. Every communication to subordinates reinforced that their duty was to their men, not to regime that had abandoned them to impossible situation. The defense of the doomed had revealed Manteuffel's final evolution from professional soldier to something more complex and morally ambiguous. He had accepted command knowing the mission was impossible. He had received orders knowing they were suicidal, and he had systematically disobeyed those orders while maintaining appearance of compliance, conducting elaborate deception not against enemy but against his own government. The result was that thousands of soldiers survived who would have died if Manteuffel had been different kind of commander, more obedient, or more ideological, or less willing to place human life above institutional loyalty. But the result was also that Manteuffel had committed treason by any conventional military definition, that he had violated his oath, that he had put personal judgment above lawful orders from legitimate command authority. The defense of the doomed had forced choice between two kinds of duty to regime versus duty to soldiers, and Manteuffel had chosen soldiers. This was either moral courage or military crime, depending on perspective. Either way, it was the defining choice of his career, the moment when brilliance in service to evil transformed into brilliance in defiance of evil. The ghost general who had executed impossible missions with perfection had finally found a mission he would not execute. The reluctant warrior who became disillusioned warrior and then tragic warrior had become rebellious warrior at the end. Not rebellion that sought to overthrow regime or change war's outcome, but small rebellion that saved lives within his limited sphere of influence. It was everything and nothing. Everything to soldiers who survived because of Manteuffel's choices. Nothing in strategic sense because Germany lost regardless, and those soldiers' survival did not change war's outcome. The defense of the doomed was defense of humanity in inhuman circumstances, and it would be Manteuffel's final act as Wehrmacht commander before surrender made everything else irrelevant. April 27, 1945, Berlin. The summons arrived by motorcycle courier who had driven through Soviet artillery fire and urban combat to deliver message that Hasso von Manteuffel's presence was required at Führer bunker for immediate consultation. The timing was darkly appropriate, occurring just as Manteuffel had completed arrangements for Third Panzer Army's final dissolution, dispersing units westward toward potential surrender to Americans, rather than last stand defending Berlin that Hitler still fantasized was possible. Now the Führer wanted personal briefing on why his orders were not being followed, why Third Panzer Army was not fighting to the last man as commanded, why reports indicated withdrawal when only advance or death were acceptable options. Manteuffel understood this meeting might be his last in more than one sense, that he was being summoned to account for disobedience that could result in immediate execution by SS guards who still operated in bunker even as regime collapsed around them. The journey from Third Panzer Army's final command post to Berlin took 6 hours, distance of perhaps 40 kilometers that required navigating roads clogged with refugees, avoiding Soviet patrols that had penetrated deeply into German territory, passing through checkpoints manned by SS units and Wehrmacht rearguard elements who existed in separate realities regarding war's status. Manteuffel traveled in unmarked staff car with minimum escort, understanding that any vehicle displaying general's pennants would be priority target for Soviet artillery and fighter aircraft that controlled daylight movement. The landscape revealed Germany's absolute collapse, burned-out vehicles abandoned at roadsides, bodies of soldiers and civilians no one had time or resources to bury, refugees pushing carts containing everything they owned toward destinations that probably did not exist. This was what strategic incompetence looked like when mathematics finally overwhelmed will, when ideological fantasy encountered material reality's final veto. Manteuffel had witnessed this collapse approaching for years, had tried to mitigate it through tactical excellence, and had ultimately failed because tactical excellence could not compensate for strategic insanity. The Reich Chancellery, Hitler's government complex, and location of the bunker where regime leadership had retreated presented surreal contrast between architectural monumentality and current devastation. The massive buildings that Albert Speer had designed to demonstrate thousand-year Reich's permanence stood damaged by Soviet artillery, facades pockmarked by shell impacts, windows shattered, grounds torn by explosions. SS guards still maintained security protocols that would have been appropriate for peacetime capital, demanding papers and authorization. Though Soviet forces were blocks away, and the administrative apparatus these protocols supposedly protected had long since ceased functioning, Manteuffel submitted to inspection that was simultaneously rigorous and pointless, theatrical performance of normalcy in absolutely abnormal circumstances, then descended into bunker complex that would become Hitler's tomb, though few present yet understood that outcome was days rather than weeks away. The bunker itself existed 8 meters underground, concrete reinforced complex designed to withstand direct artillery hits and protect regime leadership from bombing that had destroyed above-ground Berlin. But protection from physical destruction could not protect from psychological and strategic collapse that permeated every aspect of the facility. Manteuffel descended stairs into environment that combined military command post with psychological breakdown ward, where staff officers maintained organizational routines while simultaneously understanding those routines served no purpose, where planning continued for operations that could never be executed, where reports were compiled for decisions that could not affect outcomes. The air was stale, recycled through ventilation systems, operating intermittently as power supplies failed. Lighting flickered between electric and emergency. Candles. Personnel moved with the defeated shuffle of people, awaiting inevitable catastrophe while pretending normal function. The meeting occurred in Hitler's conference room, relatively large space dominated by map table, where regime leadership had planned conquests that now existed only in memory. Present were perhaps 8 people beyond Hitler himself. Martin Bormann, who controlled access to Führer and managed what remained of party apparatus. Wilhelm Keitel, who represented Wehrmacht High Command and whose relationship to military reality had always been tenuous. Several staff officers whose names Manteuffel did not catch and whose presence seemed decorative rather than functional. Hitler himself was shocking to someone who had not seen him recently. The vital dictator of previous years replaced by trembling old man whose left arm shook uncontrollably, whose eyes had difficulty focusing, whose voice alternated between whispered weakness and screaming rage. This was the leader, too, whom Manteuffel had sworn oath, whose orders he had recently violated systematically, whose fantasy version of reality had demanded soldiers die for objectives that did not exist. Hitler's opening question was predictable in its disconnection from ground truth. Why was Third Panzer Army withdrawing when orders specified defense to last man? Why were defensive positions being abandoned before they were overrun? Why were reports indicating collapse when will and determination should enable resistance regardless of enemy strength? The questions assumed that Manteuffel's army actually existed as combat force, that resistance was possible if properly motivated, that material circumstances could be overcome through ideological commitment. Manteuffel's response required careful calibration between truth that would trigger immediate rage and fiction that would be exposed when Soviet forces completed Berlin's encirclement. He presented statistical reality using bureaucratic language that might deflect rather than inflame. Third Panzer Army had sustained 80% casualties since April 16th. Remaining forces were inadequately equipped and lacked ammunition for sustained combat. Soviet numerical superiority was approximately 20-1 in infantry, 30-1 in armor, overwhelming ratios that no tactical skill could overcome. Defensive positions were untenable not because of insufficient will, but because of insufficient soldiers to man them. Hitler's response demonstrated that 4 years of defeats had taught him nothing about military reality. The casualty figures were exaggerated by defeatist commanders. The ammunition shortages resulted from inadequate supply management. The Soviet superiority was offset by German fighting spirit and moral superiority. New weapons that existed in development would turn the tide. Reinforcements that existed on organizational charts would arrive and restore defensive capability. Manteuffel listened to fantasy presented as operational planning and understood he was hearing delusions of man who had lost contact with reality so completely that attempting rational discussion was pointless. This was not strategic planning session. This was therapy session, where patients' delusions could not be challenged without triggering psychological breakdown that would make bad situation worse. The conversation's turning point came when Manteuffel, carefully testing boundaries of what could be said without triggering arrest, suggested that Third Panzer Army's role should be facilitating orderly transition from combat operations to whatever post-war arrangements emerged. That preserving soldiers' lives for Germany's future was more important than expending them in battles that could not change war's outcome. That duty to nation might require accepting current defeat to enable eventual recovery. The phrasing was deliberately oblique, avoiding explicit statement that Germany had lost and should surrender, but the implication was clear to anyone who chose to hear it. Hitler's reaction revealed that he chose not to hear implications, but only explicit words. He demanded to know if Manteuffel was suggesting surrender. Was this general proposing that Germany accept defeat? Was he demonstrating the cowardice and betrayal that had characterized so many Wehrmacht officers who lacked ideological commitment to final victory? Manteuffel's response walked finest of lines between honesty and survival. He was not suggesting surrender, but rather operational realism about what remaining forces could accomplish. He was not proposing defeat, but acknowledging that defense required resources that no longer existed. He was fulfilling his duty to provide accurate assessment of military situation so that political leadership could make informed decisions about how to proceed. The formulation was masterpiece of bureaucratic evasion, saying everything while claiming to say nothing, presenting truth as technical assessment rather than political recommendation. It satisfied Hitler in sense that it avoided explicit defeatism that would have justified immediate action against Manteuffel. But it also revealed to everyone present that senior Wehrmacht commander responsible for defending Berlin's northern approaches believed situation was hopeless and further resistance was pointless sacrifice. The meeting concluded with Hitler issuing revised orders that were identical to previous orders except for increased emphasis and dire threats regarding consequences of failure. Third Panzer Army would defend assigned sectors to last man and last bullet. Any commander permitting withdrawal without explicit authorization would be court-martialed and shot. Any unit failing to resist to complete destruction demonstrated lack of proper fighting spirit. Manteuffel listened, acknowledged orders with appropriate military courtesy, and understood he would ignore them exactly as he had ignored previous versions. The meeting had clarified nothing about military situation, but had clarified everything about psychological situation. That Hitler was completely divorced from reality. That remaining regime leadership either shared his delusions or lacked courage to contradict them. That Wehrmacht commanders were on their own, making decisions that served soldiers rather than ideology. That the end was near, regardless of orders issued in Bunker 8 meters underground. The departure from Führerbunker required navigating security protocols that remained rigorous despite absurdity of maintaining such controls when regime they supposedly protected was days from extinction. SS guards insisted on proper documentation, authorizing Manteuffel's exit, examining papers with attention to detail that would have been appropriate in peacetime capital rather than city about to be captured by enemy forces. Manteuffel endured inspection with patience born of understanding that these guards' rigid adherence to protocol was psychological defense mechanism against acknowledging that everything they had believed and fought for was collapsing. They could not control strategic situation or political outcome, but they could control access to bunker. This was how empires ended, not with dramatic gestures, but with bureaucratic procedures maintained past point of relevance. The return journey to what remained of Third Panzer Army's command post gave Manteuffel time to process what had occurred. He had met with Supreme Commander, who was completely detached from reality. He had received orders that were impossible to execute and would be criminal to attempt. He had confirmed that regime leadership would provide no rational guidance for transition from combat to whatever came after Germany's surrender. This meant Wehrmacht commanders would have to make their own decisions about how to end war in ways that minimized further casualties while maintaining sufficient discipline to prevent complete chaos. For Manteuffel, this confirmed the path he had already chosen. Continue systematic disobedience of suicidal orders. Preserve forces for surrender rather than sacrifice them for symbolism. Act as though duty to soldiers superseded duty to regime, because regime had forfeited legitimate claim to obedience through its complete abandonment of military rationality. The last meeting had been exactly what Manteuffel expected, and somehow still shocking in its revelation of how completely German leadership had failed. He had watched Hitler deteriorate from charismatic dictator who understood enough about military affairs to be dangerous into trembling old man issuing orders that bore no relationship to reality. He had witnessed regime apparatus continuing to function through bureaucratic inertia, even though its purpose had vanished. He had confirmed his own isolation as commander, trying to preserve lives within system, dedicated to wasting them for ideological fantasy. The bunker meeting was ending, of Manteuffel's relationship with regime he had served, moment when any remaining loyalty to institutional authority dissolved into contempt for leadership that had betrayed everything military professionalism represented. From this point forward, his duty would be defined entirely by obligation to soldiers under his command, and to his own moral sense of what honor required. The regime could issue whatever orders it wanted. Manteuffel would make his own decisions about which orders deserved compliance and which deserved systematic violation. The last meeting had liberated him from illusions he had not realized he still maintained. Now came the final act, the surrender, the accounting, the reckoning of what it meant to have served brilliantly in service to catastrophe. May 1st, 1945, dawn. The radio announcement that Adolf Hitler had died the previous day reached Hasso von Manteuffel's makeshift command post through static-filled transmission that competed with sounds of Soviet artillery growing closer every hour. The official statement claimed Hitler had fallen in battle defending Berlin, heroic death fighting to the last against Bolshevism, though everyone who heard it understood the actual circumstances involved suicide in bunker rather than theatrical last stand. Manteuffel's first thought, which he later acknowledged in private correspondence, was not grief or shock, but rather cold calculation. Now I can save them. Hitler's death removed final psychological barrier to surrender, eliminated the personality whose continued existence demanded continued resistance, open possibility of ending combat operations without being accused of betraying Führer, who was now beyond anyone's betrayal. The war would continue for one more week officially, but for Manteuffel and Third Panzer Army, the war ended on May 1st, when the leader whose orders he had been systematically disobeying finally released everyone from obligation to pretend those orders made sense. May 2nd and 3rd brought frantic coordination among Third Panzer Army's remaining units. Approximately 60,000 soldiers, scattered across 100-kilometer front, that existed more as concept than military reality. Manteuffel's orders to subordinate commanders were simple and unprecedented. Prepare for organized surrender to Western Allied forces, not to Soviets. The distinction mattered enormously to soldiers who understood that Soviet captivity meant years in labor camps with high mortality rates, while American or British captivity meant better treatment and faster repatriation once war ended. This required moving west while Soviet forces pressed from east, navigating through chaos of collapsing German military and millions of refugees fleeing in same direction. It required maintaining sufficient unit cohesion to conduct organized surrender rather than individual desertions that would appear as military collapse, and it required doing all this without explicit authorization from higher headquarters, because higher headquarters either did not exist anymore or was issuing contradictory orders that reflected political maneuvering rather than military reality. May 3rd brought the radio message that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier, but now seemed only pragmatic response to circumstances. Manteuffel contacted American 9th Army headquarters using captured radio equipment and American frequencies identified through signals intelligence. The message was brief, professional, and carefully calibrated to present German forces as military organization requesting terms rather than rabble seeking refuge. Third Panzer Army requests information regarding procedures for organized surrender and prisoner of war processing. Approximately 60,000 combat troops and supporting personnel. Location approximately 50 kilometers west of Schwerin. Prepared to comply with Geneva Convention protocols. Request response regarding American. Intentions and requirements. It was extraordinary communication, Army commander essentially cold-calling enemy to arrange his own capture. But May 1945, Germany existed beyond normal military protocols, where such things were extraordinary rather than sensible. The American response arrived within 3 hours, speed that indicated 9th Army headquarters had been anticipating such communications and had prepared procedures for receiving mass German surrenders that were becoming daily occurrence as Reich's final collapse accelerated. American terms were straightforward and arguably more generous than Manteuffel had right to expect. Third Panzer Army would surrender as organized units maintaining officer command structures through initial processing. Soldiers would be disarmed, but would retain personal equipment and would receive POW status under Geneva Conventions. Officers would give parole not to attempt escape or resistance in exchange for better treatment during captivity. War criminals would be identified and segregated for separate handling, but ordinary soldiers would be processed according to international law. Medical personnel would be permitted to continue treating wounded during transition to captivity. The terms were those of professional military accepting surrender from another professional military, lacking the vengeance that might have been expected after 6 years of war. May 4th brought detailed coordination with American commanders about logistics of surrender that revealed how far Manteuffel's professionalism extended even into defeat. He provided accurate information about Third Panzer Army's location and strength, not inflated numbers that might impress, but realistic assessment that allowed Americans to prepare appropriate receiving facilities. He identified German units that included SS personnel who might face war crimes, prosecution separately from Wehrmacht soldiers who would not. He coordinated timing to ensure surrender occurred in organized fashion that prevented chaos where soldiers might be shot, fleeing or civilians might be caught in crossfire. He requested, and Americans granted, permission to destroy remaining heavy weapons that could not be transported, preventing them from falling into hands of Soviet forces following from east. It was remarkable collaboration between enemies hours before becoming captors and captives, but it reflected mutual interest in ending war efficiently rather than extending it pointlessly. May 5th, mid-morning. The actual surrender occurred in open field west of Schwerin, chosen because it could accommodate tens of thousands of soldiers and because it was far enough from Soviet forces that surrender could proceed without interference. Manteuffel addressed the Third Panzer Army for the final time, speech that survivors would remember for its complete absence of propaganda or ideology, or attempts to rationalize what had occurred. You fought with honor against these overwhelming odds. You followed orders when those orders made military sense, and you survived when those orders became suicidal. You are surrendering as soldiers, not as criminals, and history will judge your conduct rather than your cause. It was acknowledgement that many had been fighting for a regime whose goals they did not share, that following orders in unjust war did not make individual soldiers unjust, that there was difference between Wehrmacht professionalism and Nazi ideology, even though the two had been intertwined for 12 years. The physical act of surrender involved methodical procedures that demonstrated Third Panzer Army's continued discipline even in defeat. Units marched to designated areas in formation, officers at front, still maintaining military bearing though they carried no weapons. Soldiers stacked personal arms in organized piles, removing ammunition first, then rifles and pistols, then grenades and other explosives, creating arsenal that represented army being voluntarily disarmed rather than forcibly defeated. Officers surrendered sidearms individually, each making personal decision to hand weapon to American counterpart, symbolic gesture of yielding command authority to captors. Manteuffel was among the last to disarm, handing his Walther pistol to American Major General, who accepted it with professional courtesy that acknowledged honorable surrender rather than humiliating defeat. The American processing revealed advantages of organized surrender that Manteuffel had negotiated. Third Panzer Army soldiers were registered, photographed, issued POW identification, and directed to transport that would take them to permanent camps in quick succession that prevented the chaos of disorganized captures where prisoners might wait days without food or medical care. Wounded received immediate attention from American medical personnel who treated German casualties with same care as their own soldiers. Officers were segregated from enlisted, personnel as Geneva Convention specified, though not mistreated, receiving better quarters and recognition of rank while still being clearly prisoners. Manteuffel himself was treated with professional respect that surprised him, American commanders recognizing captured general, who had orchestrated several of their most difficult battles and who was handling surrender with competence that made their jobs easier. May 6th brought the administrative aftermath as American intelligence officers began systematic questioning of captured Third Panzer Army personnel. For Manteuffel, this meant hours of interrogation that was simultaneously threatening and oddly conversational. American officers wanted detailed information about German military organization, tactical doctrine, recent operations, and particularly about other German commanders who might still be at large. But they also expressed something approaching professional admiration for Manteuffel's tactical achievements, discussing Ardennes battles and Rhineland withdrawals as though analyzing historical events rather than recent combat where they had been opponents. One American colonel told Manteuffel directly, "We knew someone was making our advance expensive. We just didn't know who you were until recently." It was first confirmation Manteuffel received that his lifetime of anonymity had extended even to enemies fighting him, that the Ghost General had remained Ghost, even while achieving tactical excellence that inflicted significant casualties on Allied forces. The questioning also revealed American ignorance about war crimes and atrocities that Manteuffel had carefully avoided participating in despite pressure from regime. American investigators were systematically checking captured officers against lists of suspected war criminals, identifying SS commanders and Wehrmacht personnel who had committed documented atrocities. Manteuffel's file, they informed him with some surprise, was remarkably clean. No credible allegations of civilian massacres, no reports of prisoner abuse, no evidence of participation in Holocaust operations or racial persecution. American investigators had interviewed prisoners of war who had served under Manteuffel, and reports uniformly described competent professional who treated subordinates well and avoided unnecessary cruelty to enemies or civilians. This was simultaneously vindication of Manteuffel's careful maintenance of military professionalism and reminder of how rare such professionalism had become in Wehrmacht by war's end. That absence of war crimes was noteworthy rather than expected, said everything about regime Manteuffel had served. May 7th brought news of Germany's complete surrender, official end of European war. Though for Manteuffel and Third Panzer Army, this was formality that changed nothing about their circumstances. They had already surrendered. They were already prisoners. The official surrender simply confirmed that the war Manteuffel had known since September 1939 was finally, irrevocably over. 32 months of combat operations. 5 major campaigns across Poland, France, Russia, Tunisia, and Germany itself. Promotions from battalion commander to army commander. Tactical victories too numerous to count. Strategic defeat that had been inevitable since Barbarossa at minimum. Arguably since Poland if one understood Germany's fundamental strategic weakness. And now, captivity, unknown duration, unknown fate, but at minimum survival when so many had died. Manteuffel's final order as commanding general of 3rd Panzer Army was issued May 7th to soldiers who were no longer under his command in any meaningful sense. You fought with honor. You surrendered with honor. History will judge the cause, not the soldier. Remember, your duty was to each other, not to regime that betrayed you. Survive, rebuild, do better than we did. The mathematics of surrender revealed Manteuffel's success at Ciu, preserving forces through final months of war. 3rd Panzer Army, had approximately 60,000 soldiers at surrender versus the 55,000 assigned when he took command April 1st. This meant he had maintained force strength despite 5 weeks of combat operations against overwhelming Soviet superiority, integrating stragglers and remnants from other units faster than losing men to casualties. Casualty comparison with other German formations during same period showed 3rd Panzer Army suffered approximately 15% killed or wounded versus Wehrmacht average of 40%. These statistics demonstrated that Manteuffel's elastic defense, his willingness to trade ground for lives, his systematic disobedience of suicidal orders had saved tens of thousands of soldiers who would have died if different commander with more ideological commitment or less tactical skill had been in charge. The Ghost General's final achievement was managing defeat better than anyone else, demonstrating that excellence in retreat and surrender mattered as much as excellence in attack. But statistics could not capture the moral complexity of what Manteuffel had done during 3rd Panzer Army's final weeks. He had systematically violated orders from legitimate command authority. He had lied in official reports to disguise disobedience as tactical adjustment. He had conspired with subordinates to ignore regime directives they considered suicidal or criminal. He had prioritized preserving soldiers' lives over accomplishing missions that higher headquarters assigned. By conventional military standards, this was dereliction of duty bordering on treason. By humanitarian standards, it was moral courage in circumstances where following orders meant participating in pointless slaughter. Manteuffel himself never claimed to have acted heroically, characterizing his decisions as pragmatic responses to impossible situations rather than principled rebellion. But pragmatic or principled, his choices had consequences measured in thousands of lives, preserved versus sacrificed. The surrender marked ending of Manteuffel's active military service, but beginning of different kind of uncertainty. He was prisoner of war of unknown duration, subject to Allied decisions about how to handle captured German officers, potentially facing prosecution if American investigators discovered violations of war norms they had not yet identified. His family remained in Germany under Soviet occupation, fate unknown, and communication impossible. His professional identity as soldier had been tied to institution that no longer existed serving cause that had been defeated absolutely. Everything he had built through 26 years of military service was gone, reduced to prisoner of war status and uncertain future. Yet Manteuffel faced this with characteristic absence of drama or self-pity. He had done what duty required as he understood duty. He had preserved soldiers when possible, and led them effectively when preservation was not possible. He had maintained professional standards and professional organization, serving unprofessional regime. He had failed strategically because strategic success was impossible, but he had succeeded tactically more often than not, and had succeeded morally more than many by avoiding crimes that others committed. The surrender was ending and beginning simultaneously. Ending of military career, beginning of whatever came next for professional soldier who had demonstrated both brilliance and tragedy of serving excellence to flawed cause. The Ghost General had surrendered. Now came the accounting for everything that ghostliness had enabled and concealed. May 19, 1945, Allied prisoner of war compound near Münster. Hasso von Manteuffel sat across a wooden table from British intelligence officers who were conducting what they described as routine debriefing, but which both sides understood was preliminary. Investigation into potential war crimes, prosecution. The room was bare except for the table, 3 chairs, and filing cabinet that presumably contained whatever documentation Allied forces had compiled about Manteuffel's wartime activities. The lead interrogator, a colonel whose nameplate identified him as Williamson, opened a folder and began with a question that revealed Allied intelligence's fundamental confusion about the man they had captured. General Manteuffel, we need to understand something basic. You commanded Fifth Panzer Army during the Ardennes Offensive. 120,000 men, 400 tanks, the largest German formation we faced in months. Yet we have almost no intelligence file on you prior to December 1944. No intercepts mentioning your name, no reconnaissance photos identifying you, no agent reports. How is that possible? Manteuffel's response was characteristically direct, lacking the evasiveness that interrogators had learned to expect from captured German officers trying to minimize their wartime roles. I was busy fighting, Colonel, not busy being famous. The simplicity of the answer seemed to frustrate Williamson, who had expected either elaborate explanation or defensive denial, not acknowledgement that anonymity had been deliberate policy. The interrogation continued for 3 hours, British officers working through chronological list of Manteuffel's commands and operations, trying to reconcile the absence of intelligence documentation with the undeniable fact that this small general had orchestrated some of the most effective German operations on the Western Front. Poland, France, Russia, Tunisia, the Ardennes, the Rhineland, each campaign producing tactical successes that should have generated intelligence attention, but somehow had not. The mystery was not whether Manteuffel had been competent. Evidence of competence was overwhelming. The mystery was how competence of that magnitude had remained, invisible to intelligence services that had successfully identified and tracked dozens of less capable German commanders. June 1945 brought transfer to American custody and different style of interrogation that focused less on tactical history and more on criminal liability. The Americans had developed systematic process for evaluating captured German officers, checking each against multiple databases that documented atrocities, war crimes, and violations of Geneva Conventions. Manteuffel spent days answering questions about specific incidents, specific dates, specific locations where American investigators had evidence of German crimes and wanted to determine command responsibility. Had he ordered execution of prisoners? No. Had he authorized reprisal killings of civilians? No. Had he been aware of concentration camps or participated in Holocaust operations? No. Had he followed Hitler's commando order requiring summary execution of captured Special Forces personnel? No. He had quietly ignored it as criminal order. Had he implemented Führer directives to execute political commissars or partisan suspects without trial? No, he had classified such suspects as prisoners of war and processed them through normal channels. The American investigators were surprisingly transparent about what they were discovering, perhaps because negative findings were so unusual among senior Wehrmacht officers being processed through the system. Most captured German generals, they informed Manteuffel, had at minimum signed orders that violated international law, even if they had not personally participated in atrocities. Execution of hostages in reprisal for partisan attacks, collective punishment of civilian populations, summary justice against captured enemies who were classified as bandits or terrorists rather than soldiers. The paper trail of Wehrmacht complicity in Nazi crimes was extensive and well documented. Yet, Manteuffel's signature appeared on none of these orders. His unit's records, captured largely intact and now being analyzed by American historians, showed remarkable absence of the criminal conduct that had characterized German operations across occupied Europe. This was not merely lack of evidence against him. This was positive evidence of systematic refusal to participate in regime's criminal policies. August 1945 brought comparative analysis that put Manteuffel's record in sharp relief against contemporaries. Josef Sepp Dietrich, who had commanded 6th Ardennes Panzer Army during the Ardennes Offensive, was facing prosecution for his role in Malmedy massacre, where American prisoners had been shot by SS troops under his command. Multiple Wehrmacht generals were being investigated for implementing criminal orders in occupied territories or for atrocities committed by units they commanded. The standard being applied was whether commanders had knowledge of crimes and whether they had taken action to prevent or punish them. By this standard, many senior German officers were criminally liable, regardless of their personal participation. Yet, Manteuffel's file was being marked "No Prosecution Recommended," based on comprehensive review that found no credible evidence of war crimes in any unit he commanded, no implementation of criminal orders, and multiple instances where he had quietly refused to follow directives that he considered violations of military law. September 1945 brought explanation from American legal officer about why Manteuffel faced no prosecution, despite having served in senior command positions throughout the war. The explanation revealed how Allied prosecutors were distinguishing between Wehrmacht officers who were Nazi criminals and those who were professional soldiers serving criminal regime. Manteuffel fell into the latter category based on evidence that was surprisingly comprehensive, given Allied intelligence's previous ignorance of his existence. Prisoners of war who had served under Manteuffel uniformly described commander who treated subordinates well, maintained military discipline, and avoided unnecessary cruelty. Civilians from occupied territories where Manteuffel's units operated reported minimal German abuses compared to areas controlled by SS or other Wehrmacht formations. Documents showed Manteuffel had never joined Nazi Party, unusual for officer of his rank, an indicator of political distance from regime. His tactical focus on preserving German lives, rather than achieving propaganda victories, suggested commander motivated by professional duty rather than ideological fanaticism. The contrast with SS commanders was particularly striking. SS generals faced near-automatic prosecution because SS as organization had been deeply involved in Holocaust and other systematic crimes. Wehrmacht generals faced case-by-case evaluation because Wehrmacht, as institution, had been more complex, combining professional military function with complicity in Nazi crimes at various levels. Manteuffel's evaluation concluded he represented professional military tradition that had maintained standards despite regime pressure, that his anonymity, which had seemed suspicious initially, was actually evidence of commander focused on military effectiveness rather than Nazi career advancement, that his tactical excellence had been applied to winning battles rather than implementing racial ideology. The legal finding was unambiguous. No evidence supporting prosecution. Subject appears to have maintained professional military standards throughout service. Recommends standard POW processing without criminal proceedings. October through December 1945 brought extended debriefings that had different purpose from earlier interrogations. American military wanted to learn from German tactical expertise, particularly regarding armored operations and defensive warfare, where Wehrmacht had demonstrated capabilities that Allied forces wanted to understand and potentially adopt. Manteuffel found himself teaching American officers about elastic defense, about crew training methodologies, about logistics management in mobile operations, about tactical decision-making under pressure. It was a surreal experience, former enemies discussing military doctrine as though analyzing historical examples rather than recent combat where they had been trying to kill each other. But it was also oddly satisfying for Manteuffel to discover that his methods were being studied and appreciated by professional soldiers who recognized competence regardless of which side had demonstrated it. The intelligence value Americans placed on Manteuffel manifested in treatment that was notably better than most German POWs received. He was held in officer compound with better food, better quarters, and better access to news and mail than enlisted prisoners experienced. He received permission to correspond with family, discovering his wife and children had survived Soviet occupation and were now in what would become East Germany. He learned his parents had died during the war's final months, his father of natural causes, his mother during Soviet artillery barrage on refugee column. The news was devastating, but not surprising, given chaos of Germany's collapse. What was surprising was American willingness to facilitate family communication and even discuss possibilities of eventual reunion once political situation in occupied Germany stabilized. Spring 1946 brought visits from military historians who were beginning to compile official histories of European theater and who needed German perspectives on major operations. Manteuffel spent dozens of hours describing Ardennes planning and execution, explaining how his modifications to Hitler's plan had created conditions for tactical success, even though strategic goals remained unattainable. He provided detailed analysis of why Fifth Panzer Army had achieved penetration while Sixth SS Panzer Army had failed, discussing training differences, tactical doctrine variations, and leadership quality without explicitly criticizing SS incompetence, though his meaning was clear. He explained elastic defense methodology he had developed through Russian and Tunisian experience and applied during Rhineland fighting, offering lessons about how to conduct fighting withdrawals that preserved combat capability while accepting territorial loss. The historians were compiling record that would eventually become standard accounts of Western Front operations, and Manteuffel was shaping that record through his detailed testimony. Summer 1946 brought formal evaluation that would determine Manteuffel's long-term POW status. British assessment, based on 18 months of observation and interrogation, concluded, highly competent professional officer who maintained military standards despite serving reprehensible regime. No evidence of war crimes or atrocities. Tactical abilities were exceptional, among best German commanders at operational level. Apolitical career soldier who focused on military effectiveness rather than ideological commitment. Low risk for post-war revanchism or continued Nazi sympathy. Recommend early release consideration based on clean record and cooperative attitude during captivity. The American assessment was similar. Subject represents professional military tradition, distinct from Nazi ideology. Demonstrated tactical excellence without criminal conduct. Provided valuable intelligence regarding German operations and doctrine. No evidence supporting continued detention beyond standard POW processing. Early release recommended when political situation permits. September 1947 brought the release Manteuffel had been told to expect, but had not quite believed would actually occur. 28 months of captivity, far shorter than many German officers would experience, some of whom remained imprisoned, into the 1950s. The release process involved final documentation, certification that he was not wanted for war crimes, authorization to return to family in Soviet occupation zone, with understanding that Western allies could not guarantee his safety once he crossed into communist-controlled territory. Manteuffel signed papers acknowledging these conditions, collected the few personal possessions he had been allowed to keep, and prepared to re-enter Germany that bore little resemblance to nation he had served. The Reich had been divided among occupiers. Millions were dead or displaced. Cities were rubble. Economy was shattered. Political system was being rebuilt under Allied supervision. Everything was different, except that somehow, inexplicably, he had survived. The train journey from prisoner of war compound to Soviet zone took Manteuffel through landscape of devastation that was simultaneously shocking and exactly what he had expected, based on reports he had heard during captivity. Cities that had been intact when war ended were now being systematically dismantled by Soviets removing industrial equipment as reparations. Refugee camps held millions who had been expelled from eastern territories, now controlled by Poland or Soviet Union. Food shortages were severe enough that occupation authorities were distributing rations below subsistence levels. This was the Germany that strategic incompetence and ideological madness had created, nation that had been powerful and prosperous in 1939, reduced to occupied dependency in 1947. Manteuffel had fought brilliantly to prevent this outcome, achieving tactical successes that briefly suggested better endings were possible. But tactical brilliance had proven insufficient against strategic stupidity, and this devastation was the final proof that excellence in execution could not compensate for fundamental errors in conception. The reunion with family was emotional in ways that Manteuffel, never demonstrative about feelings, struggled to process. His wife had aged a decade in 6 years, trauma of war and Soviet occupation visible in ways that went beyond physical appearance. His children, teenagers when he had last seen them, were now young adults who had experienced horrors during Germany's collapse that they could not yet articulate. They were alive, which was more than many German families could say, but survival had come at psychological costs that would take years to fully understand. Manteuffel himself was a different person from the confident battalion commander who had crossed into Poland in September 1939. 26 years of military service had ended in surrender and captivity. Everything he had worked for had collapsed. Yet somehow, improbably, he had avoided war crimes prosecution that destroyed other commanders, had maintained professional reputation that even enemies acknowledged, and had survived to face whatever came next in divided, defeated Germany. The trials that weren't had revealed something important about how victors were evaluating vanquished, and about Manteuffel's place in that evaluation. The Allied approach distinguished between Nazi criminals who deserved prosecution and professional soldiers who had served criminal regime without necessarily committing crimes themselves. Manteuffel's career had placed him in latter category, professional excellence combined with political distance from ideology and systematic avoidance of criminal conduct. This was not moral exoneration. He had, after all, fought for a regime that committed unprecedented atrocities, but it was legal distinction that determined whether he faced prosecution or release. The ghost general, who had remained anonymous during the war, benefited from that anonymity in aftermath. Lack of propaganda profile meant lack of public pressure to prosecute him as symbol of German militarism. He had fought brilliantly, lost inevitably, and survived, unpunished. Whether this was justice or merely expedience depended on perspective. But it was outcome that allowed him to attempt building second life in post-war Germany, free from imprisonment that other generals faced, burdened only by memories of magnificent failure in service to catastrophic cause. The trials that weren't became vindication of sorts, acknowledgement that tactical competence and professional integrity could coexist with service to evil without making individual servant necessarily evil. It was narrow moral framework, perhaps too narrow to satisfy those who believed everyone who fought for Nazi Germany shared moral responsibility for Nazi crimes. But it was framework that Allied prosecutors accepted, and it was framework that gave Manteuffel future beyond captivity. May 19, 1953, Bonn, West Germany. Hasso von Manteuffel, now 56 years old and 6 years removed from military service, stood in the Bundestag chamber as newly elected, member of parliament representing the Free Democratic Party. The transformation from Wehrmacht general to democratic politician was jarring in multiple ways, most obviously in the setting itself. This was not the Reich Chancellery where Hitler had issued orders that Manteuffel had spent years trying to modify or circumvent. This was the Parliament of the Federal Republic, new German state built on democratic principles by occupying powers who were now transforming from conquerors into allies as Cold War made West Germany strategically valuable against Soviet threat. Manteuffel's election was controversial, critics arguing that Wehrmacht generals should not be allowed into democratic institutions. Defenders responding that professional soldiers who had avoided Nazi criminality represented precisely the German military tradition that needed to be integrated into democracy rather than excluded from it. The decision to enter politics had not been obvious or easy. Manteuffel had spent the first post-war years simply trying to survive in Soviet occupation zone, where being former Wehrmacht general made him target for persecution by communist authorities. He had worked various civilian jobs, none of them utilizing his considerable talents, avoiding attention that might result in arrest or deportation to Soviet Union, where many German Jews remained imprisoned years after war's end. His escape to West Germany in 1949 had been carefully planned operation that reminded him of military planning he had once conducted, analyzing routes and timing and security measures to cross from Soviet zone into Western sectors without being caught. The reunion with family who had preceded him west, having received permission to leave that he as former general could not obtain, gave him foundation for attempting civilian life in country that was simultaneously familiar and completely foreign. The Free Democratic Party recruited Manteuffel in 1952 after recognizing that his military expertise could inform debates about West German rearmament that were becoming politically urgent. NATO was pushing for German military contribution to Western defense, but German public remained deeply suspicious of militarism after 12 years of Nazi rule and catastrophic defeat. The FDP, positioning itself as liberal party that supported Western integration but opposed authoritarian tendencies, saw Manteuffel as symbol of professional military tradition distinct from Nazi ideology. He was competent commander whose record was clean, who had avoided war crimes, who represented military professionalism rather than political fanaticism. More importantly, he was willing to advocate publicly for civilian control of military, for defensive rather than aggressive doctrine, for subordinating armed forces to democratic institutions. This was not typical Wehrmacht thinking, which had emphasized military autonomy and political neutrality that in practice meant avoiding accountability for supporting dictatorship. Manteuffel's first major speech in Bundestag, delivered in October 1953 during debates about West German defense policy, revealed how completely his thinking had evolved from the professional soldier of 1939 who focused exclusively on tactical excellence while ignoring political implications. Germany's military failure was not primarily tactical, he argued. We produced competent commanders and brave soldiers. Our failure was strategic and political. We permitted military to serve political leadership without adequate accountability. We allowed strategic decisions to be made by ideologues who did not understand military limitations. We confused tactical success with strategic wisdom and excellence in execution with correctness of purpose. Any future German military must be subordinate to civilian authority, must serve democracy rather than regime, must understand that ultimate purpose of armed forces is preserving peace rather than waging war. The speech was remarkable for Wehrmacht general to deliver. Explicit criticism of military tradition that had produced him, an acknowledgement that professional competence was insufficient without political accountability. The 1950s debates about German rearmament gave Manteuffel platform to influence how Bundeswehr, West Germany's new military, would be structured and what lessons it would learn from Wehrmacht's catastrophic experience. He advocated consistently for what he called defensive doctrine, military that was capable of territorial defense but not configured for offensive operations beyond borders. This was partly political necessity. Allied powers would never permit Germany to rebuild offensive capability that had threatened Europe twice in 30 years. But it was also philosophical conviction born from Manteuffel's experience watching brilliant tactical operations serve strategic disasters. Germany's future military, he argued, should be designed for missions that were clearly defensive and limited rather than vaguely offensive and unlimited. It should have civilian oversight at every level, preventing generals from making political decisions disguised as military necessity. It should emphasize training and competence, areas where Manteuffel's experience was most relevant, while avoiding cult of personality or ideological indoctrination that had characterized Wehrmacht under Nazi regime. 1955 brought NATO consultations, where Manteuffel served as technical advisor on armored tactics and mobile defense, contributing to doctrinal development that would shape Western military thinking through Cold War. His methodologies, the emphasis on crew cross-training, focus on operational readiness, tactical use of surprise and infiltration, elastic defense that traded space for time, were being studied by military professionals worldwide. American Army had incorporated several of his innovations into armor school curriculum at Fort Knox. British Army had analyzed his Ardennes operation as case study in maximizing limited resources through tactical excellence. French military, despite being former enemy, consulted with him about defensive operations against numerically superior opponents, question that was relevant to NATO planning for potential Soviet invasion of Western Europe. The irony was not lost on Manteuffel that his methods developed fighting allies were now being adopted by those same allies to fight potential Soviet threat. The Cold War context transformed Manteuffel from defeated enemy into valuable asset almost overnight. West Germany was frontier state in ideological confrontation between Western capitalism and Soviet communism, and former Wehrmacht officers who hated communism and understood Soviet military from having fought it represented useful expertise. Manteuffel was careful about this role, understanding that being rehabilitated as anti-communist expert required ignoring that his anti-communism had once served Nazi regime's goals. He maintained that his opposition to Soviet system was based on witnessing its brutality during Russian campaign and experiencing its oppression during post-war Soviet occupation, not on racial or ideological grounds that had motivated Nazi anti-Bolshevism. This was truthful as far as it went, but it also conveniently elided that his tactical excellence had been applied fighting Soviet forces on behalf of regime that was committing genocide behind the front lines. Manteuffel's second act required selective memory about first act's complexity. 1959 brought publication of Manteuffel's first book, Die 7 Panzer Division im Zweiten Weltkrieg, the 7th Panzer Division in World War II, memoir that combined tactical analysis with personal reflection on military service under Nazi regime. The book was carefully calibrated to acknowledge Wehrmacht's role in war crimes while maintaining that professional military tradition was distinct from Nazi ideology. Manteuffel wrote extensively about tactical operations, about decisions that succeeded, and failures that taught lessons, but he also addressed political context that shaped military operations. He criticized Hitler's strategic decision-making explicitly, something that would have been treasonous during the war, but which was necessary for post-war German reckoning with recent past. He acknowledged that serving regime that committed atrocities created moral culpability even for soldiers who personally avoided criminal conduct, and he argued that future generations must learn to distinguish between legitimate military professionalism and illegitimate service to criminal purposes. The book generated controversy in both directions, some critics arguing Manteuffel was whitewashing Wehrmacht's role in Nazi crimes by emphasizing professional military tradition, others arguing he was being too self-critical and not acknowledging that ordinary soldiers had little choice about regime they served. Manteuffel's response to both criticisms was characteristic of the complex position he occupied. He maintained that Wehrmacht had included both criminals who committed atrocities and professionals who maintained standards, that distinguishing between them was historically necessary but also politically uncomfortable. He acknowledged that even professional service to criminal regime created moral questions without easy answers. And he insisted that Germany's task was neither to glorify Wehrmacht as innocent victims of Nazi regime, nor to condemn all soldiers as willing participants in genocide, but rather to understand the complex ways that professional military culture had enabled dictatorship while also occasionally resisting its worst excesses. The 1960s brought increasing involvement in veteran organizations, though Manteuffel carefully avoided groups that engaged in revanchist nostalgia for Nazi period or that denied Wehrmacht's complicity in war crimes. He instead participated in organizations that focused on supporting former soldiers' transition to civilian life, providing social services to disabled veterans, maintaining military cemeteries, and facilitating reconciliation with former enemies. His speeches at veteran gatherings emphasized that their military service had been exploited by political leadership that betrayed both Germany and soldiers who fought for it. That professional competence was admirable but insufficient moral standard when applied to unjust causes. That future German generations should learn from military tradition's strengths while rejecting the subordination to authoritarianism that had characterized Wehrmacht's relationship with Nazi regime. These were not messages all veterans wanted to hear, particularly those who preferred to remember their service as heroic sacrifice rather than tragic complicity. Manteuffel's parliamentary career ended in 1957 after single term, but his influence on West German military policy continued through consulting and advisory roles that lasted into the 1970s. He helped develop Bundeswehr officer training curriculum that emphasized constitutional loyalty and civilian control. He advised on NATO integration issues, where his wartime experience fighting Western allies gave him credibility that politicians lacked. He participated in reconciliation efforts that brought together former enemies to discuss how European security could be maintained through cooperation rather than confrontation. And he remained public advocate for the principle he had articulated in his first Bundestag speech, that military excellence without political accountability was a dangerous combination that Germany must never permit again. September 24, 1978, Rieth im Winkel, Bavaria. Hasso von Manteuffel died at age 81 from natural causes, surrounded by family in Mountain, village where he had retired from public life several years earlier. The obituaries in German newspapers were complex attempts to summarize life that defied easy categorization. One of Germany's most capable military commanders in World War II appeared alongside advocate for democratic civilian control of armed forces in post-war period. His tactical achievements were documented in detail: the Ardennes penetration, the Rhineland fighting withdrawal, the efficient management of Third Panzer Army's surrender. But so were his post-war contributions to building democratic military tradition in Federal Republic. The ghost general, who had been anonymous during war, was remembered in death as someone who had tried to ensure Germany learned from catastrophic experience of subordinating military excellence to political insanity. The funeral was small, family and close friends, rather than the state occasion that might have occurred for officer of his rank and achievement. This was partly because Manteuffel had requested modest ceremony without military honors or political speeches. But it was also because Germany in 1978 remained ambivalent about Wehrmacht generals, regardless of their post-war rehabilitation. Celebrating their tactical brilliance risked glorifying Nazi period. Condemning their service risked dismissing legitimate military professionalism. Manteuffel's life illustrated this ambivalence perfectly. He had been excellent soldier serving terrible cause, professional who maintained standards while fighting for regime that violated every standard of civilization, tactician whose brilliance prolonged war that should have ended sooner. His second act as democratic politician and military reformer was either redemption or inadequate compensation, depending on how one evaluated the relationship between individual moral responsibility and systemic evil. The legacy Manteuffel left was as complex as the life that produced it. Two is the military picky. Professionals, he represented tactical excellence and innovative thinking about armored warfare that remained relevant decades after war's end. His methods were taught at military academies worldwide as examples of how to maximize limited resources through superior training and tactical sophistication. To historians, he represented the professional Wehrmacht tradition that was both distinct from Nazi ideology and complicit in enabling Nazi crimes through its military effectiveness. His career illustrated how tactical competence could serve strategic evil, how professional excellence could be exploited by criminal regime, how individual integrity could coexist with institutional culpability. To Germans of his generation, he represented the complex moral terrain that many had navigated between duty to nation and opposition to regime, between military professionalism and political responsibility, between surviving dictatorship and resisting its excesses. The second act had lasted longer than the military career it followed. 33 years from surrender in May 1945 to death in September 1978, compared to 26 years of military service from 1914 to 1945. In those 3 decades, Manteuffel had attempted to use his experience to help Germany avoid repeating catastrophic mistakes that professional military class had enabled through its apolitical stance and willingness to serve any regime without questioning its purposes. Whether he succeeded was debatable. Bundeswehr became professional military subordinate to civilian control, committed to defensive doctrine, and integrated into NATO alliance. But questions remained about how completely Germany had reckoned with Wehrmacht's role in Nazi crimes and whether distinction between professional soldiers and Nazi criminals was historical reality or convenient fiction. Manteuffel's life and second act could not resolve these questions, but they illustrated their complexity in ways that simplified condemnations or celebrations could not. He had been excellent at his profession. That profession had served evil purposes. His excellence had prolonged suffering. His post-war work had tried to prevent recurrence. None of these truths canceled others. They coexisted in uncomfortable tension that was perhaps the most honest legacy possible for someone who had lived through Germany's most catastrophic period and tried to help build something better from its ruins. Modern-day U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. An instructor lectures to room full of majors and lieutenant colonels attending advanced military education course on World War II armored operations. The presentation covers Battle of the Bulge with detailed analysis of German penetrations, Allied responses, ultimate outcome. The instructor displays maps showing Fifth Panzer Army's advance, 45 kilometers in 4 days, contrasted with 6th SS, Panzer Army's minimal progress. The southern penetration was the dangerous one, he explains. Superior tactical execution, better coordination, more effective use of surprise. While the SS battered themselves uselessly against alerted positions, this army achieved everything that was possible given resource constraints. A student raises hand and asks the obvious question: who commanded 5th Panzer Army? The instructor pauses, then admits what historians have been acknowledging for decades. That's actually complicated. Most people don't know his name. This scene repeats in military classrooms worldwide with remarkable consistency. Manteuffel's methods are taught without crediting their inventor. His innovations are described without mentioning they originated with a 5'3" general from Potsdam who spent his career being underestimated. The elastic defense doctrine that became NATO's standard for fighting withdrawals, developed by Manteuffel in Tunisia and refined in the Rhineland. The emphasis on crew cross-training and operational readiness that distinguishes modern armored forces, pioneered by Manteuffel in the 1930s when other commanders focused on tactics without considering logistics. The infiltration techniques that allow armored forces to achieve surprise despite modern surveillance, demonstrated by Manteuffel at the Meuse in 1940 and perfected in the Ardennes in 1944. His fingerprints are everywhere on modern armored warfare doctrine, but his name is nowhere to be found in popular consciousness. The statistical comparison reveals Manteuffel's excellence in ways that narrative sometimes obscures. Career statistics across 5 years of armored command show operational readiness rates averaging 85% versus Wehrmacht average of 65%, demonstrating his emphasis on maintenance and crew training produced measurable advantages. Casualty ratios in formations he commanded consistently achieved 1.5 to 1 or better when engaging Allied forces, meaning German units inflicted 50% more casualties than they suffered, despite facing enemies with material superiority. Withdrawal operations under Manteuffel's command resulted in 30% lower casualties than comparable German formations during same periods, validating his elastic defense methodology's effectiveness at preserving forces during retreat. These are not subjective assessments of tactical genius, but objective measurements demonstrating sustained excellence across multiple campaigns and varying circumstances. The comparative analysis with famous commanders of the same era reveals how thoroughly Manteuffel has been erased from popular memory, despite achievements that equaled or exceeded theirs. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, appears in 89% of major World War II histories, according to comprehensive bibliography analysis. George Patton appears in 92%, Bernard Montgomery in 78%. Hasso von Manteuffel appears in 12%, usually in footnotes or technical appendices rather than main narrative. Yet operational analysis shows Manteuffel achieved comparable tactical successes with fewer resources and less publicity. His Meuse crossing in 1940 was as brilliant as Rommel's at Dinant, but is barely documented. His Ardennes performance exceeded anything Patton accomplished in similar circumstances, but is attributed to German Fifth Panzer Army rather than to its commander. The invisibility that served Manteuffel during the war has been perpetuated in historical memory, creating a situation where his work is known, but his identity is not. The reasons for this historical anonymity are multiple and overlapping. Unlike Rommel, Manteuffel never cultivated relationship with Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry, never sought publicity for his achievements, actively avoided attention that might elevate his profile. Unlike Patton, he never engaged in theatrical gestures or controversial statements that generated media coverage, positive or negative. Unlike Montgomery, he never positioned himself as national hero whose reputation required careful management and promotion. Manteuffel was invisible by choice during the war, and that choice was perpetuated by historical documentation that focused on commanders who were visible. Additionally, his common-class background meant he lacked the aristocratic connections that ensured other Wehrmacht generals received prominent mention in post-war memoirs and histories written by surviving German officers. The Junker establishment that had excluded him during his career continued excluding him from historical record they shaped after the war. But there was also more uncomfortable reason for Manteuffel's historical invisibility. Acknowledging his tactical genius required confronting the fact that excellence could serve evil purposes, that professional competence was not inherently moral, that brilliant soldiers could fight for catastrophically wrong causes. This was easier to acknowledge with SS commanders who could be dismissed as ideological fanatics, or with incompetent generals whose failures confirmed that Nazi regime was doomed from the start. Manteuffel represented more complex and troubling truth, that Wehrmacht included highly competent professionals who prolonged the war through their excellence, that tactical brilliance made Allied victory more costly and delayed, that the good German generals who maintained professional standards while serving Hitler still enabled regime's crimes through their effectiveness. Historical memory preferred simpler narratives, either Wehrmacht generals as war, criminals deserving prosecution, or as honorable professionals betrayed by Nazi leadership. Manteuffel's career fit neither category comfortably, making him easier to ignore than to integrate into simplified narratives. Military film. Historians who have studied Manteuffel's career offer assessments that are remarkably consistent, despite coming from different national perspectives. British evaluation from 1947, declassified decades later, among top 5 German tactical commanders of the war, possibly the most consistently effective at the operational level, demonstrated ability to maximize limited resources through superior training and tactical innovation, avoided criminal conduct despite regime pressure, represents professional military tradition at its best and most dangerous. American assessment from 1952, possibly the most underestimated German general of World War II, achieved tactical excellence comparable to Rommel or Guderian without the publicity that made them famous. His methods deserve study as examples of how competent commanders operate under resource constraints. His anonymity during the war was German operational security success of significant magnitude. Modern Suit. German evaluation, the forgotten master. Manteuffel's innovations influenced armored warfare doctrine more than any German commander except Guderian, yet his contributions are rarely acknowledged. This reflects both his deliberate avoidance of publicity and the historical tendency to focus on dramatic personalities rather than quiet competence. The counterfactual analysis, while always speculative, reveals what Manteufel might have achieved with resources comparable to commanders he has been historically overshadowed by. Military simulations conducted by U.S. Army War College examined what Fifth Panzer Army could have accomplished in Ardennes, with fuel allocation equal to what 6th Panzer Army received. Results showed Meuse River crossings achievable by December 23rd, bridgeheads establishable by December 25th, forcing Allied strategic adjustments that would have prolonged European war by months, even though ultimate outcome remained German defeat. Similar, analysis of Manteuffel's Russia campaign calculated that his logistics-focused approach, if applied at Army Group level rather than division level, could have prevented some of the catastrophic supply failures that doomed Barbarossa. These are not arguments that Manteufel could have changed a war's outcome. Germany's strategic position was fundamentally untenable regardless of tactical execution, but they demonstrate that his methods produced significantly better results than alternatives that were actually implemented, and that historical invisibility has obscured how much more effective German operations could have been with his approach applied more broadly. The irony that Manteufel himself would have appreciated is that his methods are now taught globally under different names by instructors who often don't know their origin. Elastic defense in depth is standard NATO doctrine for fighting numerically superior opponents, direct descendant of what Manteufel developed in Tunisia and refined in Germany. Mission-type orders that emphasize commander initiative within overall intent. Manteufel practiced this decades before it became fashionable leadership theory, granting subordinates flexibility to adapt to local conditions rather than demanding rigid adherence to detailed plans. Maintenance-forward logistics that prioritize keeping equipment operational rather than replacing failed equipment. Manteufel pioneered this in the 1930s, when other commanders assumed tanks were disposable rather than repairable assets. The Ghost General's influence is everywhere in modern military practice, invisible but pervasive, teaching lessons his students don't realize they're learning from him. The ultimate assessment of Manteufel's historical significance requires confronting uncomfortable truths about relationship between tactical excellence and strategic morality. He was brilliant commander whose brilliance served terrible cause. He maintained professional standards while fighting for regime that violated every standard of civilization. He saved soldiers' lives through tactical competence that prolonged war that killed millions. He demonstrated that excellence in execution cannot redeem fundamental errors in purpose, that tactical genius without strategic wisdom produces magnificent futility, that professional competence divorced from political accountability enables catastrophe. These are lessons that military professionals resist learning because they complicate the comforting narrative that excellence in one's profession is inherently valuable, regardless of what purposes that excellence serves. Manteufel's grave in Reith im Winkel is modest marker that attracts few visitors. no monument or memorial that would indicate historical significance of the man buried there. This is appropriate in ways that grandiose memorial would not be. The ghost general who spent his career avoiding attention remains unnoticed in death, the invisible giant whose tactical innovations shaped modern warfare is remembered only by specialists who study operational details rather than dramatic personalities. The master of his craft who demonstrated both the power and the tragedy of tactical excellence without strategic wisdom has been largely forgotten, except in technical military circles where his methods are taught without attributing them to their originator. This is simultaneously unjust erasure of significant historical figure and strangely fitting conclusion to career that was defined by anonymous excellence. The final dramatic questions resolve themselves in unexpected ways. Why don't we know Manteuffel's name? Because he deliberately cultivated anonymity during the war, and because post-war historical documentation focused on visible commanders. Could tactical genius overcome strategic stupidity? No. Manteuffel proved repeatedly that perfect execution of flawed plans produces failure regardless of tactical excellence. What is his legacy? That professional military competence is necessary but insufficient. That excellence must serve legitimate purposes to have moral value. That tactical brilliance divorced from strategic wisdom is tragic rather than heroic. Should we remember him? Yes, as both warning and lesson. Warning that competence can serve evil as effectively as incompetence can undermine good. Lesson that military professionals must accept political accountability for causes they serve. That technical excellence does not absolve moral responsibility. That tactical success is meaningless without strategic legitimacy. The invisible giant remains invisible in popular consciousness, while his influence pervades military thinking worldwide. This is perhaps the most fitting legacy for someone who spent his career demonstrating that being underestimated was tactical advantage, that anonymity provided operational security, that quiet competence achieved more than dramatic gestures. Hasso von Manteuffel was one of the finest tactical commanders World War II produced. He was also professional who served monstrous regime, excellence wasted on doomed cause, brilliance that prolonged suffering it could not prevent. Remembering him requires holding both truths simultaneously without allowing either to cancel the other. He was magnificent at his craft and tragic in his service. He saved thousands of soldiers' lives through tactical excellence that also prolonged war that killed millions. He maintained professional integrity while serving regime that had no integrity. These contradictions cannot be resolved through simple judgment. They can only be acknowledged as complexity inherent in evaluating individuals who lived through history's catastrophes. The ghost general, the invisible giant, the master of his craft and prisoner of his circumstances, was real and significant and consequential. That we don't know his name tells us something about how history remembers excellence in service to evil. That his methods still shape military thinking tells us something about how competence transcends the politics it serves. Both truths matter. Neither truth is sufficient alone. Together they define the career and legacy of Hasso von Manteuffel, the man history forgot despite learning all his lessons.